September 10th, 1874, marked the day the decision was made on the banks of McClellan Creek in the Texas Panhandle. The late summer heat pressed down on the 6th Cavalry with a physical weight, drying the mud along the creek bed and cracking the leather of saddles left exposed to the sun. Colonel Nelson A. Miles sat within the canvas walls of his field tent, studying a map that offered little comfort regarding his logistical situation. His column had been pursuing hostile bands of Kiowa, Comanche, and Southern Cheyenne across the Staked Plains for weeks, engaging in a relentless campaign to force the tribes onto reservations. The constant movement had drained the expedition of essential supplies, and the distance between his forward operating base and the main depot at Camp Supply in Indian Territory had stretched to a dangerous length. Communication had to be established to coordinate the movement of provisions, but the territory between McClellan Creek and the supply camp was thick with roving war parties. Miles needed men who could navigate the unforgiving terrain without drawing the attention of hundreds of warriors who monitored the wagon roads and river crossings. He summoned 2 of his most trusted civilian scouts to his quarters. William Dixon, known to every man in the territory simply as Billy, stood waiting outside the tent flaps. At 24 years of age, Dixon possessed a reserve of experience that belied his youth, having spent years hunting buffalo and surviving the harsh realities of the frontier. Standing beside him was Amos Chapman, a man whose reputation for toughness equaled Dixon's. Chapman served as an interpreter and scout, wearing a mix of military-issue clothing and frontier buckskins, a testament to his life spent navigating the cultural and physical divides of the region. The colonel explained the situation with military brevity. Dispatch papers needed to travel from the temporary headquarters on McClellan Creek to the command at Camp Supply. The route covered roughly 150 miles of open, hostile country. Miles made it clear that the assignment carried a high probability of death. The main body of the hostile tribes had been scattered but not defeated, and small aggressive bands were scouring the plains for stragglers or small detachments. A large force would move too slowly and attract too much attention, while a single rider would likely fall prey to an ambush without anyone knowing his fate. A small, cohesive group offered the best balance of speed and defensive capability. Dixon and Chapman accepted the assignment without hesitation. It was the nature of their employment, and the pay for scouts reflected the hazards they absorbed. Miles directed them to select 4 enlisted men from the 6th Cavalry to accompany them as a guard detail. The choice of soldiers was critical. They needed men who could ride hard, shoot accurately under pressure, and maintain their composure when isolated from the support of the main column. The scouts moved to the bivouac areas where the troopers rested in the shade of the cottonwood trees, looking for specific individuals who had proven themselves in the earlier engagements of the Red River War. Sergeant Zachariah T. Woodhull of Company I was the first man identified for the detail. As a non-commissioned officer, Woodhull brought a level of discipline and command structure that would be necessary if the scouts became incapacitated. He was a seasoned soldier, familiar with the rigors of the campaign and the expectations of his superiors. Following Woodhull, they selected Private Peter Rath from Company A, along with Private John Harrington from Company H and Private George W. Smith from Company M. These 4 men were pulled from their duties and ordered to report for the special detail. They were informed of the mission parameters: a direct run to Camp Supply with urgent dispatches moving through the heart of the enemy's hunting grounds. Preparation for the patrol began immediately. The 6 men checked their weaponry with meticulous care. Billy Dixon carried a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, a .50 caliber weapon capable of delivering massive kinetic energy at long ranges. The rifle was a single-shot breechloader, requiring the shooter to manually insert a cartridge, fire, and extract the casing, but its accuracy and stopping power were superior to the standard military carbines for long-distance engagement. Amos Chapman also favored a heavy rifle, understanding that keeping an enemy at a distance was the primary defense for a small group. The four soldiers, Woodhull, Rath, Smith, and Harrington, were armed with the standard-issue Springfield Model 1873 carbines. These trapdoor rifles fired a .45 caliber slug backed by 70 grains of black powder. They were robust weapons designed for cavalry use, but possessed a shorter effective range than the specialized Buffalo guns carried by the scouts. Each man also carried a sidearm. The Colt single-action Army revolvers were inspected, cylinders spun, and loading gates checked for smooth operation. These pistols were weapons of last resort, useful only when the fighting descended into close-quarters brawls. Ammunition was the next priority. A soldier on a standard patrol might carry a regulation load, but this mission required more. They stuffed their saddlebags and cartridge belts with as many rounds as they could reasonably transport without overburdening the horses. Dixon ensured he had a substantial supply of the large brass cartridges for his sharps, knowing that if they were pinned down, his rifle would be the tool that kept the attackers beyond the range of accurate return fire. The selection of horses was as important as the selection of men. The animals needed to be in prime condition, capable of sustaining a steady pace for days while retaining the strength to sprint if an escape became necessary. The 6 men walked the picket lines, examining hooves and checking the backs of the mounts for saddle sores. They chose sturdy cavalry horses that showed alertness and good muscle tone. The tack was adjusted to ensure a perfect fit. A loose cinch or a rubbing stirrup leather could disable a horse as surely as a bullet. They packed light, carrying only essential rations, hardtack, coffee, and cured meat. Water canteens were filled to the brim from the creek, the canvas covers soaked to keep the contents cool through evaporation. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, the reality of the mission settled over the group. They were leaving the safety of the regiment, which numbered hundreds of guns, to venture into a void where they would be outnumbered by thousands of potential adversaries. The Kiowa and Comanche knew this land intimately. They knew every draw, every watering hole, and every ridge. The 6 men would be intruders in a landscape that offered no natural sanctuary. The plan was to travel primarily at night to avoid detection, hiding during the daylight hours in whatever cover they could find. Colonel Miles handed the dispatch pouch to Sergeant Woodhull. The leather satchel contained the official requests for grain, ammunition, and reinforcements. Woodhull secured the pouch to his saddle, checking the straps twice. The men mounted up as the sky turned a bruised purple. The air cooled slightly, but the heat radiating from the ground remained intense. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by the thousands of hooves in the main camp. The 6 riders guided their horses away from the noise and smoke of the fires, heading toward the open prairie. The departure was unceremonious. There were no bands playing or flags waving. They simply rode out of the picket lines and into the deepening twilight. The McClellan Creek camp faded behind them, the sounds of men and mules diminishing until the only noise was the rhythmic thud of their own horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the creak of saddle leather. They adopted a formation that allowed them to watch all points of the compass. Dixon and Chapman rode point, their eyes scanning the horizon for the silhouette of a rider or the telltale dust cloud that would indicate a moving column of warriors. The soldiers followed, keeping a tight interval. Their route took them generally southeast, aiming to cross the divide between Gageby Creek and the Washita River. This area was known for its lack of water and its exposed topography. The vegetation consisted of short buffalo grass, sagebrush, and prickly pear cactus. Trees were non-existent except along the dry creek beds that scarred the landscape. It was a terrain that offered excellent fields of fire but zero concealment for anyone caught in the open. The night was moonless, forcing them to rely on the stars and their knowledge of the landmarks to maintain their bearing. Billy Dixon rode, with his rifle resting across his saddle horn. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, picking out the shapes of the terrain. He knew the Kiowa were moving. The pressure from Miles' column had forced the tribes to break camp and migrate. And a migration meant warriors would be screening the movements of their families and herds. The patrol was riding directly across the grain of this movement. Every mile they covered increased the likelihood of crossing a trail or bumping into a scouting party. Amos Chapman rode silently beside him. He knew the habits of the Comanche well. They preferred to attack at dawn or when they had a clear tactical advantage. They would not likely engage a group of 6 heavily armed men at night unless they stumbled upon them by accident. The danger lay in being spotted. Once spotted, the signal mirrors would flash from the hilltops and the smoke signals would rise, drawing every warrior within 20 miles to their location. The first few hours of the ride passed without incident. The horses settled into a ground-eating walk. The men spoke in hushed tones if they spoke at all. The isolation was absolute. There were no homesteads, no telegraph poles, no fences. This was the frontier in its rawest form. The only law that applied here was the ballistics of a .45 caliber slug and the speed of a horse. As they pushed deeper into the night, the terrain began to change. The ground became more broken with shallow ravines and washouts that required careful navigation. A horse stepping into a prairie dog hole could snap a leg instantly, leaving a man on foot in the middle of nowhere. The riders kept a close watch on the ground immediately in front of their mounts. The darkness hid the depth of the cuts in the earth, making every descent into a gully a calculated risk. Sergeant Woodhull checked his pocket watch by the light of the stars. It was past midnight. They had covered a good distance, putting several miles between themselves and the main column. The farther they went, the more the silence pressed in on them. It was a silence that felt heavy, charged with the potential for violence. The nocturnal wildlife of the plains was active. The howl of a coyote would occasionally pierce the air, causing the men to tighten their grip on their reins. In this country, a coyote call might be an animal, or it might be a scout signaling his companions. Private Smith rode at the rear of the formation. He kept looking back, watching their back trail. It was easy for a tracking party to follow the sign of 6-shod horses, even in the dark, if the ground was soft enough. He scanned the horizon for movement, for a shadow that detached itself from the landscape. Nothing moved back there. The emptiness was total. Private Rath and Private Harrington flanked the sergeant. They were young men, but the campaign had hardened them. They rode with the easy posture of men who practically lived in the saddle. Their carbines were not in the scabbards, but held in their hands, butts resting on their thighs, muzzles pointed skyward. They were ready to bring the weapons to bear in a fraction of a second. The group halted briefly to water the horses from a small, muddy pool in a depression. The animals drank greedily, the noise of their slurping loud in the quiet night. The men dismounted to stretch their legs and listen. They stood in a circle facing outward. Dixon knelt, placing his ear near the ground, listening for the vibration of hoofbeats that could travel for miles through the earth. He heard nothing but the wind rustling the dry grass. "We keep moving," Chapman said, his voice a low rumble. "Need to make the Washita break before sunup." They remounted and continued. The goal was to find a secluded spot before the dawn broke to rest and wait out the daylight hours. Traveling by day was suicide in this sector. The sun would reveal them to any watcher on a high point for 10 miles in any direction. They needed a ravine or a cluster of mesquite bushes deep enough to hide the horses. As the hours wore on, the temperature dropped, chilling the sweat on their shirts. The physical fatigue of the ride began to set in, but the adrenaline of the mission kept their senses sharp. Every rustle of the brush, every snap of a twig sounded like a threat. They were 6 men floating in a vast ocean of grass entirely cut off from the world they knew. By 3 in the morning, the terrain leveled out again. They were approaching the divide. The ground here was flat as a table, stretching endlessly into the dark. This was the most dangerous ground. If they were caught here, there was no cover, no rocks, no trees, no ridges, just grass and sky. Dixon urged his horse into a trot, wanting to cross the open expanse as quickly as possible. The others followed suit, the tempo of the hooves increasing. The rhythm of the ride became hypnotic. Thud, 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 the creak of leather, the jingle of a bit chain. They were a singular unit, bound by the necessity of survival. The dispatch pouch in Woodhull's saddlebag was the reason for their presence, but staying alive was the immediate objective. Approaching 4 in the morning, the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of gray. The false dawn was approaching. They needed to find cover soon. Dixon signaled for a halt. He stood in his stirrups, scanning the dim horizon. To the south, he made out the dark line of a creek bed. It was likely a tributary of the Washita. It might offer the concealment they needed. He pointed, and the group veered toward the depression. As they rode closer, the details of the landscape emerged from the gloom. It was a shallow wash lined with scrub brush and tall grass. It wasn't a fortress, but it would hide a horse if the animal lay down or stood deep in the brush. They rode into the wash, the horses sliding slightly on the loose soil of the bank. Once at the bottom, they dismounted immediately. The men led the horses into the thickest part of the brush. They loosened the cinches to let the horses breathe, but did not unsaddle. If they had to run, they would need to be ready in seconds. Dixon and Chapman climbed back up the bank to a vantage point just below the rim of the wash. They lay on their bellies in the grass, using their field glasses to sweep the brightening horizon. The sun was not yet up, but the light was growing stronger by the minute. The vast prairie revealed itself, an ocean of brown and green, empty and still. "Looks clear," Chapman muttered, lowering his glasses. "For now," Dixon replied. He didn't relax. He knew that the empty prairie was a deception. The enemy was out there. The Kiowa and Comanche were masters of camouflage. 1,000 warriors could be hiding in the folds of the earth within 5 miles of them, and they would never know until the trap was sprung. The soldiers settled in the bottom of the wash, chewing on hardtack and taking pulls from their canteens. They spoke in whispers, checking their weapons again. The metallic click of a loading gate being checked was the only mechanical sound. The date was now September 11th. The first night was over. They had survived the initial run from the camp, but they were now deep in the kill zone. The sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant reds and oranges. It was a beautiful sight that heralded the beginning of a long, hot, dangerous day of hiding. The heat began to build almost instantly. Flies buzzed around the horses. The men settled into wait, eyes heavy with lack of sleep, nerves stretched tight. They were 6 tiny specks in a hostile wilderness, holding their breath, waiting for the sun to go down again so they could run the gauntlet once more. September 11th, 1874 brought a sunrise that offered no mercy to the 6 men hidden within the shallow depression of the wash. The sun climbed rapidly, burning off the cool respite of the night and replacing it with a stifling, heavy heat that settled into the low ground. The scrub brush and tall grass provided visual concealment, but they did little to block the solar intensity that baked the soil. The air grew stagnant, trapped between the banks of the dry creek bed. Sweat ran freely down the backs of the troopers, soaking into their wool shirts and attracting swarms of gnats and biting flies that seemed to materialize from the earth itself. The horses stamped their hooves in irritation, their tails swishing constantly to ward off the pests. Each stomp of a hoof sounded impossibly loud in the stillness, causing Sergeant Woodhull to cast anxious glances at the animals, silently willing them to remain calm. Billy Dixon and Amos Chapman took turns crawling to the lip of the wash to scan the surrounding prairie. The heat shimmer distorted the horizon, turning the distant landscape into a wavering mirage of brown and yellow. It was a tedious, nerve-wracking duty. They were looking for the flash of sunlight on a lance tip, the dark speck of a scout, or the rising column of smoke that would indicate a camp. For hours there was nothing but the empty, rolling plains. The isolation was deceptive. It felt as though they were the only living things on Earth. Yet they knew that just beyond the curve of the Earth, the land was alive with movement. The Kiowa and Comanche were not stationary. They were a mobile force, and the patrol was sitting squarely in their path. The soldiers spent the long hours of daylight checking their equipment for the 100th time. Private Rath sat with his back against the dirt bank, using a rag to wipe a speck of dust from the receiver of his carbine. Private Smith and Private Harrington tried to sleep, pulling their hats over their eyes, but the heat and the tension made true rest impossible. They dozed in fitful starts, jerking awake at the snap of a twig or the snort of a horse. The water in their canteens grew warm and unrefreshing, but they rationed it carefully. Dehydration was a silent enemy that could kill them as surely as a bullet. They took small sips, holding the water in their mouths to moisten their tongues before swallowing. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began its slow descent, the shadows stretching across the bottom of the wash. The temperature did not drop immediately, but the direct assault of the rays lessened. The men stirred, stretching cramped limbs and shaking off the lethargy of the day. They chewed on strips of dried beef, the salty meat requiring more water to wash down. Conversation was minimal. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said. They all knew the plan. Ride hard, ride quiet, and pray they didn't bump into the main body of the hostile force. Dusk finally settled over the plains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and slate gray. The horizon lost its definition, merging with the darkening sky. It was time to move. Woodhull gave the signal and the men tightened the cinches on their saddles. The horses, sensing the change in routine, perked up, their ears swiveling. The men led the mounts up the bank of the wash, their boots struggling for purchase in the loose soil. Once on the flat ground, they paused to listen. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the buffalo grass, a sound that could mask their movement but also hide the approach of an enemy. They mounted up, the leather creaking under their weight. Dixon took the point again, guiding them southeast. They were entering the High Divide now, the vast tableland that separated Gageby Creek from the Washita River. This was the most exposed section of their journey. The land here was flat, seemingly endless, and devoid of significant cover. If they were spotted here during daylight, there would be no wash to hide in, no rocks to fortify. They would be specks on a billiard table. The darkness deepened, and the patrol settled into a steady trot. The stars emerged, a sprawling canopy of diamonds that offered the only light. Navigation relied on keeping certain constellations in specific relation to their line of travel. Dixon rode with a hunter's slouch, his body moving in rhythm with his horse, his eyes constantly moving. He scanned the ground directly in front of him, looking for badger holes or sudden drops, while simultaneously keeping a peripheral watch on the skyline. The vastness of the prairie at night was disorienting. Distances became impossible to judge. A dark shape could be a bush 10 yards away or a hill a mile distant. Hours passed in the saddle. The rhythm of the ride became a dull ache in the lower back and knees. The horses breathed steadily, their nostrils flaring as they inhaled the cool night air. The smell of the plains was distinct, a mixture of dry grass, dust, and the faint, acrid scent of sage. Suddenly, Chapman signaled a halt. He held up a hand and the group reined in instantly. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. Chapman pointed to the ground. Crossing their path, running generally north to south, was a wide swath of trampled earth. In the dim starlight, it looked like a dark highway cut through the grass. Dixon dismounted and knelt by the trail. He touched the ground, feeling the torn vegetation and the pulverized soil. This was not a game trail. It was the trail of a massive migration. The grass had been beaten flat by thousands of ponies, the drag marks of travois poles cutting deep grooves into the dirt. The sheer scale of the movement was staggering. It wasn't just a war party, it was an entire village, perhaps several villages moving together. Dixon stood up and dusted off his hands. He spoke in a whisper that barely carried to the others. The sign was fresh. The edges of the hoof prints were sharp, not yet eroded by the wind. The droppings left by the ponies were not fully dried. This massive column had passed here recently, perhaps only hours before. The patrol had just crossed the wake of the very enemy they were trying to avoid. The realization sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the night air. They were not just in hostile territory. They were riding through the middle of a major concentration of Kiowa and Comanche power. Woodhull looked at Dixon, the question hanging in the air without being spoken. They could not turn back. McClellan Creek was too far, and they had no supplies to make the return trip. The only way was forward toward Camp Supply. They had to cross this trail and put as much distance between themselves and the migration as possible before the sun returned. If they were caught near this trail when the light came, stragglers or rear guards would spot them instantly. They spurred their horses, increasing the pace from a trot to a loping canter. The urgency of the situation overrode the need to conserve the horses' energy. They needed miles. The thudding of hooves quickened, a drumbeat of desperation on the hard prairie floor. They rode across the trail, the horses stumbling slightly on the rough, churned-up ground, and then back onto the undisturbed grass on the other side. They pushed hard, the wind rushing past their ears, the manes of the horses whipping in their faces. For the next 2 hours, they rode with a singular focus. The landscape blurred into a dark stream of motion. Every shadow that loomed large was a potential ambush. Every dip in the ground was a potential trap. The tension was physically exhausting, a tight knot in the stomach that refused to loosen. The soldiers gripped their carbines, their knuckles white. They were 6 men racing against the rotation of the earth, trying to outrun the dawn. As they rode, the terrain began to change subtly. The absolute flatness of the high divide gave way to slightly more rolling ground as they approached the breaks of the Washita River. This offered a double-edged sword. The rolling ground provided valleys to hide in, but the ridges offered high points for enemy scouts to observe from. The moon had not risen, which was a blessing, but the starlight was bright enough to cast faint shadows. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, the horses began to show signs of fatigue. Their breathing became labored, their coats slick with sweat despite the cool air. Woodhull signaled to slow down to a walk. They could not afford to ride the animals into the ground. If they lost the horses, they were dead. The men listened intently as the pace slowed. The silence of the night was broken only by the heaving sides of the mounts and the crunch of dry grass. "We need to find a spot," Chapman murmured to Dixon. "Sun's coming sooner than we like." Dixon nodded. He scanned the horizon. The blackness of the sky to the east was just beginning to dilute, the stars losing their brilliance. They were running out of time. The landscape here was open with only gentle undulations. There were no deep canyons, no thick timber. It was poor country for hiding. They pushed on, hoping for a miracle of geography, a deep washout, a buffalo wallow, anything that would lower their profile. The gray light of pre-dawn began to seep into the sky, revealing the vastness of the world around them. The color began to return to the grass, turning it from black to a pale, ghostly gray. The horizon expanded, pushing back the curtain of night. With the coming light, the vulnerability of their position became terrifyingly clear. They were on a broad, gentle slope that descended toward the distant line of the Washita River. To their north and west, the ground rose slightly, blocking their view. To the south and east, it fell away. They were exposed on three sides. Dixon spotted a cluster of plum thickets and tall grass roughly a mile ahead. Wasn't perfect, but it was the only vegetation that stood higher than a man's knee. He pointed and the group veered toward it. As they rode, the rim of the sun began to push against the eastern horizon, igniting the clouds with streaks of crimson. It was the morning of September 12th. They reached the thicket just as the first true rays of sunlight struck the tops of the hills. They dismounted hurriedly, leading the horses into the center of the brush. The animals were tired, their heads hanging low. The men were equally exhausted, their eyes gritty, their bodies sore from the pounding ride. They stripped the saddles to let the horses' backs cool, but kept the bridles on. Woodhull set the guard rotation immediately. There would be no sleep this morning. The proximity to the Indian trail they had crossed in the night meant that scouts could be anywhere. Dixon took the first watch, crawling to the edge of the thicket with his field glasses. He lay prone, the dew on the grass soaking the front of his shirt. He swept the horizon slowly, moving the glasses from left to right. The prairie was waking up. Meadowlarks called out, flitting between the grass stalks. A herd of antelope grazed in the distance, their white rumps flashing in the sunlight. It looked peaceful, a pastoral scene of untouched wilderness. But Dixon knew better. The antelope were nervous, their heads snapping up frequently to check the wind. Something was disturbing them. He focused his glasses on a ridgeline to the west, back in the direction they had come. At first he saw nothing. Then a tiny movement caught his eye. A silhouette broke the smooth line of the hill. It was a rider, then another, and another. They were miles away, just specks against the sky, but there was no mistaking what they were. "Company," Dixon said, his voice flat. The other men froze. Chapman crawled up beside him, taking the glasses. He watched for a long moment, his jaw set. He handed the glasses back to Dixon. "Scouts," Chapman said. "Looking for stragglers from the herd." The enemy riders disappeared behind the ridge, moving south. They hadn't seen the patrol yet. The 6 men in the thicket held their breath. If the riders kept moving south, they might pass by. If they turned east, they would cut the patrol's trail in the dew-heavy grass. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the vast stage upon which they were hiding. The heat began to return, promising another day of baking intensity. The men checked their weapons again, the metallic clicks sounding loud in the brush. They were 6 men alone in the middle of a hunting ground, and the hunters were quartering the field. Dixon watched the ridge line for an hour, but the riders did not reappear. The tension eased slightly, but the reality remained. They were surrounded by a presence they could feel but not always see. The trail they had crossed in the night was a scar on the land that connected them to the violence of the territory. As the morning progressed, the men tried to rest, but their eyes kept darting to the horizon. The landscape of the divide was unforgiving. It offered no fortress, no walls. Their only defense was invisibility. If that failed, they would have to rely on the rifles in their hands and the steadiness of their aim. Smith opened his saddlebag and took out a piece of hardtack. He gnawed on it slowly, the dry cracker turning to paste in his mouth. He looked at the others. They were all thinking the same thing. How many were out there? The sign on the trail suggested thousands. The odds were impossible to calculate. Around mid-morning, the wind shifted, blowing from the west. It carried the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke. Someone had fired up a morning camp. It wasn't close, perhaps 5 or 10 miles away, but it was a reminder that domestic life for the tribes was proceeding as usual just over the horizon. The patrol was an anomaly, a foreign element in a world that belonged to the Kiowa and Comanche. Dixon shifted his position, his muscles cramping from lying still. He looked at the horses. They were grazing on the grass within the circle of the thicket. They needed the food. If a chase started, they would need every ounce of energy. He patted the neck of his mount, feeling the coarse hair. The horse nickered softly. The sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows. The world was bright and hard. The divide was a place of extremes, extreme heat, extreme distance, extreme danger. The 6 men were suspended in the center of it, waiting for the dice to roll. They had navigated the night and the open ground, but the day was long and the eyes of the enemy were sharp. The crossing of the divide was not just a physical journey, it was a psychological gauntlet, and they were only halfway through. Every creak of leather and jingle of a bit chain seemed amplified in the vacuum of sound. The horses were nervous, their ears swiveling back and forth, nostrils flaring to catch scents that the men could not detect. Amos Chapman rode beside Dixon, his face a mask of concentration. He knew the Kiowa and Comanche were moving in force. The trail they had crossed the previous night was proof enough, but the absence of game was the more immediate indicator. The buffalo, the antelope, and even the coyotes had vacated this corridor, pushed aside by the passage of an apex predator. The land felt empty, but it was an emptiness charged with potential violence. Suddenly, a movement on a distant ridgeline to the west shattered the illusion of solitude. A single rider appeared, crested the rise, and then halted. He sat motionless on his pony, silhouetted against the bright morning sky. Dixon raised his hand and the patrol stopped instantly. The men brought their carbines to the ready, straining to identify the figure. For a moment, hope lingered that it might be a scout from Colonel Miles' column or a friendly guide from the supply camp. The figure raised a rifle, not in greeting but in a signal. Behind the lone rider, the ridge suddenly erupted with motion. A second rider appeared, then a third, then 10, then 20. They poured over the crest like water breaking through a dam. It was a war party, and it was massive. The sheer number of warriors emerging from the dead ground was staggering. They were not a small raiding band. This was a fighting force of the combined Southern Plains tribes. In seconds, the skyline was thick with mounted combatants, their lance tips catching the sun, their feathers fluttering in the breeze of their own movement. Kiowa and Comanche, Chapman stated, his voice devoid of emotion. A lot of them. The initial group of warriors, numbering perhaps 50, did not hesitate. Upon spotting the 6 intruders, they kicked their ponies into a gallop, streaming down the slope in a chaotic, terrifying charge. The sound reached the patrol a moment later, a low rumble that grew into a thunderous roar of hoofbeats, punctuated by the high-pitched, ululating war cries that curdled the blood. Sergeant Woodhull barked a command, but the tactical options were non-existent. There was no cover to run to. The plum thicket was miles behind them, and the Washita River was still miles ahead. They were caught on the billiard table of the plains. The only choice was to fight a delaying action, to keep moving and hope to find a depression or a washout before they were overrun. "Keep together," Woodhull shouted over the rising din. "Don't let them cut us off." The patrol spurred their mounts, pushing the tired animals into a gallop. They rode roughly parallel to the charging force, trying to maintain a buffer of distance while moving toward the only high ground in their immediate vicinity, a slight rise several hundred yards away that might offer a field of fire. The warriors, seeing the prey run, accelerated. Their ponies were fresh, unburdened by heavy cavalry saddles and grain bags. They closed the gap with frightening speed. As the distance shrank, the details of the attackers became visible, transforming the dark mass into individual agents of destruction. They were painted for war. Faces were smeared with vermilion and ochre, chests marked with black stripes. They wore buckskin leggings and breechclouts, their hair braided with otter fur and silver conchos. Some carried repeating Winchester rifles purchased from Comancheros or captured in previous raids. Others wielded heavy trade muskets, brass-tacked and lethal. Many carried lances and bows, weapons that could kill silently and efficiently. The first shots rang out from the charging line. Puffs of white smoke blossomed against the brown grass. The sound was a flat crack, followed instantly by the angry buzz of slugs passing through the air around the patrol. A bullet kicked up a spray of dirt near the hooves of Private Rath's horse. Another whined past Private Smith's ear, snapping like a bullwhip. The patrol returned fire, twisting in their saddles to discharge their carbines. The Springfield trapdoors roared, sending heavy .45 caliber rounds downrange, but firing from a galloping horse was a game of luck more than skill. The warriors did not just charge directly. They began to fan out. It was a classic tactic, the horns of the buffalo. The center pressed the attack while the flanks raced ahead to encircle the enemy. Riders on fast ponies sprinted to get in front of the patrol, cutting off their forward progress. To the left and right, more warriors poured, over the ridges joining the fray. The initial 50 had grown. Now there were easily over 125 fighting men converging on the 6 isolated riders. Dixon slowed his horse, letting the others pass him slightly. He needed a steady platform. He hauled back on the reins, the horse sliding to a halt. He raised the heavy sharps, the octagon barrel steadying in his grip. He tracked a warrior who was leading the flank on the right, a man riding a paint pony and waving a rifle above his head. Dixon exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The big 50 roared, a sound distinct from the crack of the carbines and the pop of the Winchesters. The recoil punched into his shoulder. Downrange, the warrior was lifted from the back of his pony as if yanked by an invisible rope. He tumbled into the grass and his pony veered away. The shot momentarily checked the advance on that flank, the other warriors pulling up or swerving to avoid the fate of their comrade. Dixon racked the lever of the sharps, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and shoved a fresh cartridge into the breech. He spurred his horse, galloping to catch up with the group. The brief pause had bought them seconds, but the noose was tightening. The volume of fire intensified. The air seemed solid with projectiles. Arrows began to arc through the sky, falling like hail. They struck the ground with a wet thud, standing quivering in the turf. A bullet struck Private Harrington's saddlebag, tearing through the leather and shattering a tin cup inside. The jolt nearly unseated him, but he clung to the horn, his face pale and set in a grimace of determination. The patrol reached the slight rise they had been aiming for, but it offered little advantage. It was barely a pimple on the prairie, providing no cover, only a slightly better view of their impending doom. From this vantage point, the full scale of the ambush was revealed. The prairie was alive with movement. Riders were circling them completely now, a swirling vortex of dust and noise. The dust, kicked up by the hundreds of hooves, created a choking cloud that hung over the battlefield, filtering the sunlight into a hazy, copper-colored glare. Amos Chapman shouted to Woodhull, pointing to the north. A large group of Comanches was massing for a concentrated charge. They were bunching up, their horses chest to rump, preparing to ride straight over the patrol. The discipline of the group held. They formed a rough circle, their horses' rumps touching, facing outward toward the threat. They fired in volleys, the deep boom of the carbines creating a wall of noise. The warriors circled, riding low on the sides of their ponies, using the animals' bodies as shields. They fired from under the necks of their mounts, presenting almost no target to the soldiers. It was a display of horsemanship that was both beautiful and terrifying. They taunted the soldiers, their voices carrying over the gunfire. They shouted insults in Spanish and broken English, calling them cowards and women, daring them to come out and fight man to man. Private Smith fired his carbine until the barrel was too hot to touch. He fumbled for a fresh cartridge from his belt, his fingers shaking slightly. The sheer brute force of the attack was overwhelming. There was no pause, no respite. The enemy was relentless, pressing closer with every pass. They could see the whites of the warriors' eyes now, could see the grimaces of exertion and the snarls of aggression. A bullet struck the ground inches from Dixon's boot, spraying dirt into his eyes. He blinked the grit away, not breaking his rhythm. He fired, reloaded, fired, reloaded. The Sharps was a devastating weapon, and at this range it punched through ponies and men alike. But for every warrior that fell, two more seemed to take his place. The numbers were impossibly skewed. The horses of the patrol were frantic. They spun and kicked, terrified by the screaming warriors and the smell of blood that was beginning to taint the air. Controlling the mounts while trying to aim was becoming impossible. Woodhull's horse took a grazing wound to the flank, screaming and bucking, nearly throwing the sergeant into the dirt. He fought the animal down, sawing on the bit, his face streaked with sweat and dust. "We can't stay on the horses," Chapman yelled. "They're big targets. We're going to get shot to pieces." But to dismount in the open was suicide. If they lost the horses, they lost their mobility. They would be stranded. Yet remaining mounted was becoming equally fatal. The warriors were targeting the animals, knowing that a man on foot in the middle of the staked plains was a dead man. The circling warriors tightened the loop. They rode within 50 yards, their fire becoming more accurate. A slug smashed into the stock of Rath's carbine, splintering the wood but leaving the action intact. He cursed, checking the weapon, and fired back. The proximity of the enemy was suffocating. The heat of the sun combined with the heat of the guns and the press of bodies made the air thick and hard to breathe. Suddenly a new group of warriors appeared from a ravine to the east. They were fresh, their ponies rested. They slammed into the flank of the circling mass, adding their weight to the siege. The ground shook with the impact of their arrival. The dust cloud thickened, reducing visibility to a confused blur of motion. Dixon saw a warrior with a lance charging directly at him. The man was young, his chest bare, a red sash tied around his waist. He held the lance high, the iron tip gleaming. Dixon swung the barrel of the Sharps, tracking the motion. He didn't have time to aim properly. He pointed and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the pony in the chest. The animal collapsed instantly, turning a somersault. The rider was thrown clear, landing hard in the grass. He scrambled to his feet, knife in hand, but a volley from the other soldiers drove him back into the swirling dust. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The patrol was taking fire from all sides. There was no rear, no front, just a 360-degree circle of death. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire, screams and hoofbeats that battered the senses. "They're fixing to rush us," Woodhull screamed. He was right. The circling stopped. The warriors pulled back slightly, regrouping. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. The dust began to settle, revealing the ring of enemies. They sat on their ponies, chests heaving, rifles resting on their thighs. They were measuring the distance, calculating the cost of the final push. The 6 men looked at each other. They were covered in dust, their eyes wide and rimmed with red. They were alive, but for how long? The realization settled in that this was not a skirmish they could ride away from. They were pinned. The vastness of the prairie, which had been their danger, was now their prison. There was nowhere to run. The leader of the war party, a Comanche chief with a headdress of eagle feathers that trailed down the side of his horse, raised his rifle. He shouted a command that echoed across the gap. 100 voices answered him. The line of warriors surged forward. They were not shooting now. They were coming to crush the patrol with the weight of their horses and the fury of their lances. The ground trembled as the charge began. It was a wall of muscle and bone moving at 30 miles an hour. The 6 men raised their weapons, knowing that 6 bullets would not stop 100. They fired into the mass, the smoke from their guns instantly swept away by the wind of the approaching horde. The impact was imminent. The psychological weight of the charge was crushing. To stand before such a force required a suspension of the survival instinct. The men braced themselves, knees bent in the stirrups, teeth clenched. This was the moment the world narrowed down to the front sight of a rifle and the beating of a heart. The charge broke over them like a wave. The warriors did not collide directly, but swept through and around the small group, splitting the formation. The air was filled with the swinging of clubbed rifles and the thrusting of lances. It was a melee of confusion. A pony slammed into Smith's horse, spinning it around. A warrior grabbed at Harrington's bridle, trying to cut the reins. It was chaos in its purest form. The structure of the patrol disintegrated. They were 6 individuals fighting for personal space in a sea of enemies. The dust rose again, blinding and choking. The screams of men and horses merged into a single note of agony. In the midst of the swirl, Dixon saw the hopelessness of the mounted fight. They were too high, too exposed. Every second they stayed in the saddle was a second borrowed from the grave. They had to get to the ground. They had to find the earth. "Get down!" Dixon roared, his voice cracking with strain. "Get off the horses!" The command was barely audible, but the necessity was clear. The transition from the frantic mobility of the running fight to the static desperation of the stand was about to begin. The warriors wheeled their ponies for another pass, sensing the confusion. They had the patrol broken and confused. Now came the kill. The sun beat down, indifferent to the violence. It was mid-morning on the 12th of September, and the Battle of the Buffalo Wallow had begun in earnest. The open prairie, once a place of silence and wind, was now a cauldron of blood and fire. The 6 men were no longer riding to camp supply. They were fighting to draw one more breath. The vast distance to safety had become irrelevant. The only distance that existed was the range of a Winchester rifle. The 12th of September continued to unfold under the relentless glare of the sun, the time now approaching mid-morning. The collision of the 2 forces, the 6 frantic riders and the overwhelming tide of Kiowa and Comanche warriors, had shattered the momentum of the ride. The decision to abandon the saddles was not a tactical choice born of careful deliberation. It was a physical necessity forced by the sheer volume of projectiles occupying the air around them. To remain elevated on the back of a horse was to invite immediate death. The height of a mounted man provided a focal point for every rifle and bow on the prairie, and the enemy was concentrating their fire with devastating effect. Sergeant Woodhull screamed the order to dismount again, his voice raw and barely audible over the cacophony of the fight. The horses were screaming, a high-pitched, terrifying sound that cut through the thunder of gunfire. They were animals bred for service, but the sensory overload of the encirclement had driven them into a state of primal panic. They reared and plunged, their eyes rolling white, fighting the bits that held them in check. The men fought their own mounts as much as the enemy, hauling on the reins to force the animals to a standstill long enough to slide from the saddles. Billy Dixon kicked his feet free of the stirrups and vaulted off his horse, hitting the hard ground with a jarring impact. The dust was thick, swirling in choking clouds that obscured vision and clogged the throat. He landed on his knees, his Sharps rifle clutched in his right hand, the knuckles white. The earth felt solid and unyielding, a stark contrast to the shifting, heaving platform of the saddle. He didn't stand up. Instinct and experience slammed him flat against the soil. He pressed his body into the dirt, trying to make himself as thin as a sheet of paper. Above him, the air hissed and popped with the passage of bullets. Amos Chapman hit the ground a few yards away. He held the reins of his horse in a death grip, trying to pull the animal down with him. The horse, a sturdy bay, was struck in the flank by a heavy-caliber slug. The animal bucked violently, ripping the leather reins through Chapman's hands, tearing the skin from his palms. The horse collapsed, thrashing its legs in the air, its hooves acting as lethal bludgeons in the confined space. Chapman rolled away, narrowly avoiding a kick that would have shattered his skull. He scrambled into a prone position, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. The transition from the chaotic motion of the charge to the static defense of the ground changed the geometry of the battle. The warriors, seeing the white men go to ground, adjusted their tactics instantly. They did not press the charge into the teeth of the stationary rifles. Instead, they pulled back slightly, forming a lethal ring at a distance of 200 yards. They dismounted as well, using their ponies as living breastworks, resting their rifles over the saddles to deliver accurate, aimed fire. The skirmish had evolved into a siege in the middle of nowhere. Private Rath and Private Harrington were on the ground, their carbines barking in steady rhythm. They lay on their bellies, their elbows digging into the dry grass. The vegetation was short, barely 6 inches high, offering no true cover. It provided only a fragile screen that made them difficult to spot if they remained perfectly still. But every time they fired, the puff of black powder smoke marked their position. The return fire was instantaneous. Bullets struck the ground in front of them, spraying dirt into their faces and stinging their skin with grit. The horses of the patrol were now the primary targets. The Kiowa and Comanche understood the strategic reality of the plains. A man without a horse was a man who would eventually die. They poured their fire into the cluster of animals. One by one, the cavalry mounts were hit. The sounds of bullets striking flesh, a wet, heavy thud, were distinct from the sharp crack of the rifles. The horses screamed and kicked, tangling their legs in the reins and stirrup leathers. Some broke free, galloping blindly into the open prairie, their saddles slipping sideways, their panic driving them straight into the lines of the enemy. With the horses went the supplies. The canteens filled with precious water were strapped to the saddles. The heavy coats necessary for the freezing nights that could descend on the plains were rolled behind the cantles. The extra ammunition, the dried beef, the medical supplies, all of it was thundering away or collapsing into the dust as the animals died. The 6 men were being stripped of every tool they possessed, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs, the weapons in their hands, and the ammunition on their belts. Private George W. Smith was struggling to control his mount, a terrified gray that was rearing and spinning. Smith had one foot on the ground, the other caught for a split second in the stirrup. As he wrenched his boot free, a warrior less than 50 yards away leveled a rifle. The shot was clean and devastating. The heavy slug caught Smith in the chest, punching through the ribs on his left side and tearing into the lung. The impact spun Smith around like a rag doll. He collapsed onto the grass, the air leaving his body in a gurgling wheeze. He didn't scream. The shock of the massive trauma silenced him instantly. He lay on his back, his hands clutching at his chest, blood beginning to stain the blue wool of his uniform a dark, glistening purple. The bright, frothy blood of a lung wound bubbled from his lips with every ragged breath. "I'm hit!" Smith gasped, the words wet and choked. "They got me!" Dixon saw Smith fall. He crawled toward him, keeping his head low, the bullets clipping the tops of the grass stalks inches above his hat. He reached Smith and grabbed his collar, dragging him slightly closer to the center of their loose perimeter. There was nothing he could do for the wound. The hole was jagged and deep, sucking air with a sickening sound. Smith's face had gone pale, the color draining away as his heart struggled to pump blood through the damaged organ. "Stay down, John," Dixon said, his voice grim. "Just stay flat." The reality of their situation settled over the group with the weight of a physical blow. They were 6 men, 5 effective, 1 dying, stranded on a vast, flat expanse of the staked plains. There was no depression, no rock pile, no tree. They were exposed on a tabletop. The sun, now climbing toward its zenith, beat down on them with hammering intensity. The heat rose from the ground, baking them from below while the sun roasted them from above. The warriors sensed the vulnerability. They began to tighten the circle again, moving their firing positions closer. The volume of fire increased. It wasn't just rifles now. Arrows began to arc high into the air, descending almost vertically. The silent missiles were terrifying. You couldn't hear them coming until they struck the ground with a vicious thud. One arrow pierced the calf of Sergeant Woodhull's boot, grazing the skin but pinning the leather to the ground. He ripped it out with a curse, snapping the shaft and tossing it aside. The men formed a rough triangle, facing outward in all directions. They fired carefully, conserving their ammunition. They knew that if they ran dry, the fight would end in a rush of knives and tomahawks. Every shot had to count. Dixon rolled onto his back to reload the sharps, shoving a heavy .50 caliber cartridge into the breech. He rolled back over, resting the heavy octagon barrel on his forearm. He sighted on a warrior who was crawling through the grass, trying to get within bow range. Dixon exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking back against his shoulder. The warrior stopped moving, his body going limp in the grass, but for every enemy they neutralized, the pressure remained constant. The sheer number of attackers meant that they could maintain a continuous rate of fire that the patrol could not match. The ground around the men was being chewed up. Divots of earth exploded upward, showering them with dirt. A bullet struck the metal canteen on Harrington's belt, which had miraculously stayed with him. The vessel exploded, the water soaking his trousers in a fleeting moment of coolness that was quickly replaced by the realization that his water supply was gone. The noise was deafening. The continuous roar of the large-bore rifles, the screams of the dying horses, and the war cries of the Kiowa and Comanche created a wall of sound that made communication impossible. They fought as individuals, linked only by their proximity and their shared desperation. They checked their comrades with quick glances, ensuring that everyone was still moving, still firing. Smith lay in the center of their formation, his breathing becoming more labored. The fluid filling his lungs made a rattling sound that was audible even over the gunfire. He was conscious, his eyes wide with the realization of his mortality. He tried to lift his carbine, but the strength had left his arms. He lay staring at the blue sky, watching the white puffs of gun smoke drift across his field of vision. The pain was immense, a burning fire in his chest that radiated outward with every beat of his heart. Dixon knew they couldn't stay there. The flat ground was a killing floor. If they remained where they were, they would be picked off one by one. The warriors would eventually realize that the return fire was slackening and would rush them. They needed a defensive position, anything that would offer hard cover. He scanned the immediate area, his eyes stinging with sweat and dust. The terrain looked uniform, a relentless monotony of grass and dirt. To the west, about 100 yards away, the ground seemed to dip slightly. It wasn't a ravine or a creek bed, just a variation in the surface of the plain. It was a subtle feature, easily missed, but to a man hunting for survival, it stood out. It might be a buffalo wallow, a depression created by the great beasts rolling in the dirt to shed their winter coats or ward off flies. Over years, these wallows could become several feet deep and 10 to 20 feet across. "We have to move," Dixon yelled to Woodhull. "We can't hold this." Woodhull looked at the wounded Smith, then at the dead horses, then at the encircling enemy. He knew Dixon was right. To stay was to die. To move was to risk death, but it offered a slim chance of changing the odds. "Where?" Woodhull shouted back. Dixon pointed toward the slight depression. "There. Whatever it is, it's lower than here." The decision to move was fraught with peril. It meant standing up, or at least crouching and running through a hail of bullets. It meant dragging Smith, who was dead weight. It meant leaving the last of the supplies that might have fallen from the horses. But the alternative was the certainty of a massacre on the open grass. Before they could execute the movement, a fresh volley of fire swept over them. The warriors had crept closer, using the tall grass in a shallow swale to the north to mask their approach. The bullets slashed through the air just inches above the ground. Private Wrath cried out as a bullet grazed his arm, tearing the sleeve of his shirt and leaving a bloody furrow in the flesh. He ignored the wound, racking the slide of his carbine and firing blindly into the smoke. The psychological strain was immense. The 6 men were isolated in a way that few humans ever experience. They were a tiny island of life in a sea of hostility. The nearest help was 75 miles away. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no cavalry bugle sounding the charge. They were entirely on their own, dependent solely on their grit and their aim. The sun reached its peak, 12 o'clock high. The shadows vanished. The light was absolute, revealing every detail of the horrific scene. The carcasses of the horses were already beginning to bloat in the heat, the flies descending on the blood-soaked ground. The smell of gunpowder, copper blood, and raw fear hung heavy in the still air. Amos Chapman crawled over to Smith. He looked at the wound and shook his head slightly at Dixon. It was a killing shot. Smith shouldn't be alive, yet he held on, his body fighting the inevitable. Chapman grabbed Smith's ammunition belt. If Smith couldn't shoot, his bullets were needed by those who could. He pulled a handful of cartridges and shoved them into his pocket. "We're going to move you, John," Chapman said, his voice rough. "Going to get you to some cover." Smith nodded weakly, unable to speak. His lips were coated in red foam. He gripped Chapman's wrist with a surprising strength, the desperation of a dying man clinging to the living. The warriors saw the men shifting. They sensed the panic. The ululating cries rose in pitch and intensity. They stood up from behind their ponies, firing rapidly, trying to pin the soldiers down, trying to break their nerve. The bullets kicked up a continuous spray of dirt, creating a localized dust storm around the 6 men, leading to low visibility. Dixon fired his sharps until the barrel was too hot to touch. He had to wrap his neckerchief around the forestock to keep from burning his hand. The heavy recoil was bruising his shoulder, turning the muscle into a tenderized mass, but he didn't feel it. Adrenaline flooded his system, sharpening his vision, slowing down time. He saw the flash of a muzzle, the flight of an arrow, the grimace on Woodhull's face. They were moments away from the sprint. They were gathering their courage, tightening their bootlaces, checking their loads. The transition from the flat ground to the depression would be the most dangerous 10 seconds of their lives. If they were caught in the open upright, they would be cut down. The horses that had not been killed had fled, disappearing over the horizon, taking the last link to the outside world with them. The patrol was now infantry. They were foot soldiers on a battlefield that belonged to the horsemen. The disadvantage was total. Speed, mobility, height. The enemy held every card. The only thing the patrol held was the center of the circle and the will to refuse to die. Dixon looked at the depression again. It was their only hope. It was a shallow bowl of dirt, insignificant in the grand scheme of the landscape, but right now it was the most important piece of real estate on Earth. It was a fortress waiting to be claimed. "Ready?" Woodhull asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Ready," the men replied, their voices lost in the roar of the guns. They prepared to launch themselves into the void, to run the gauntlet of fire. The flat prairie, which had been their travel route, was now their enemy. It offered them up to the guns of the Comanche. They had to get below the surface. They had to dig in. The dismount was complete. The siege was set. Now began the race for the Wallow. Come noon, the sun stood directly overhead, a blinding white disk that cast no shadows to hide within, exposing the 6 men to the full vertical weight of the solar glare. The decision to abandon the cluster of dead horses was absolute. The carcasses, while providing a modicum of cover from direct fire, were rapidly becoming a trap. The concentrated volume of rifle fire from the Kiowa and Comanche lines was chewing the animal flesh to pieces, and the angles of the enemy attack were widening, threatening to enfilade their position from the flanks. The Buffalo Wallow William Dixon had identified lay approximately 100 yards to the west, a distance that, under normal circumstances, would require less than 15 seconds to traverse. Under the sweeping gaze of over 100 riflemen, it was a gauntlet of lethal probability. Dixon tightened his grip on the Sharp's rifle, his knuckles bleaching white against the dark walnut stock. He looked at Sergeant Woodhull, who gave a grim nod, the signal that the time for hesitation had expired. The men gathered their remaining strength, the adrenaline surging through their systems to override the fatigue of the morning's ride and the fight. They sprang from the prone position, pushing off the hard-packed earth with a sudden violence that kicked up small clouds of dust. The transition from the static safety of the ground to the upright vulnerability of the sprint was jarring. The air, previously a zone of potential danger, became an immediate physical resistance, thick with the sonic cracks of passing projectiles. The four able-bodied men, Dixon, Woodhull, Rath, and Harrington, launched themselves toward the depression. Amos Chapman, despite his limp, moved with a surprising agility born of desperation, keeping pace with the group. They ran in a low crouch, their bodies bent at the waist to minimize their target profile, their boots pounding a frantic rhythm on the dry buffalo grass. The sensation of exposure was total. There was no cover, no concealment, nothing between their backs and the enemy guns but the thin fabric of their shirts and the turbulent air. The reaction from the warrior line was instantaneous. The firing, which had lulled slightly as the attackers repositioned, erupted into a continuous roar. The ground around the running men boiled with impacts. Bullets struck the earth with the sound of angry whips cracking, spraying dirt and gravel against their legs. A slug tore through the heel of Harrington's boot, sending a jolt up his leg but failing to break the stride. He stumbled, his hand brushing the ground to regain balance, and kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of copper and dust. Dixon ran with his eyes locked on the destination. The wallow was a subtle feature, a saucer-shaped erosion in the prairie floor created by generations of bison rolling in the dust to shed insects and winter coats. As he closed the distance, the details of the sanctuary became clear. It was roughly 10 feet in diameter, a circular scar of sandy loam that sat perhaps 2 feet below the level of the surrounding grass. It was not a fortress. It was barely a hole. But in a landscape of zero elevation, a negative elevation of 24 inches was significant. They reached the lip of the wallow and dove, not sliding but throwing their bodies into the depression with reckless force. They hit the sandy bottom hard, the impact knocking the wind from their lungs. They rolled instantly, scrambling to the perimeter, pressing themselves against the low rim of the earth. The incoming fire tracked them all the way. As they hit the dirt, the lip of the wallow exploded in a series of small eruptions as bullets slammed into the turf they had just crossed. "Dig!" Dixon roared, his voice hoarse from the dust. "Dig or die!" The command was unnecessary. The survival instinct had already taken over. The men holstered their firearms or laid them in the sand and drew their knives. These were not small pocket knives, but heavy butcher knives and skinning blades, tools designed for the rough work of the frontier. They stabbed the blades into the side of the bank, loosening the soil, and then scooped the earth away with their free hands. The objective was to create an earthwork, a berm that would raise the height of their cover from 2 feet to 3 or 4. The ground was hard, baked by the summer sun into a substance resembling fired clay. The knives chipped and scraped, the metal groaning against the resistance. Dixon drove his heavy knife into the soil, twisting the blade to break up the clods, his shoulder muscles burning with the exertion. He worked with a frenzied intensity, ignoring the sweat that poured into his eyes and stung the grit already lodged there. Every handful of dirt thrown up onto the rim was a potential life saved, a physical barrier between his flesh and the heavy-caliber slugs singing overhead. Private Rath worked beside him, using a trowel bayonet he had retrieved from his gear. The tool was more effective than the knives, allowing him to move larger volumes of earth. He shoveled the dirt onto the northern rim, facing the heaviest concentration of fire. The soil was dry and sandy, prone to crumbling back down into the pit. They had to pack it down, slamming their fists into the loose pile to compress it into a solid rampart. The dust raised by their digging hung in the stagnant air of the depression, coating their faces in a mask of mud. The Kiowa and Comanche warriors, realizing their prey had gone to ground, adjusted their fire. They began to target the rim of the wallow specifically. Bullets thudded into the growing berm, burying themselves in the fresh earth. Occasionally, a round would pass through the loose soil near the top, showering the men inside with high-velocity sand. It was a terrifying game of inches. If a man raised his head too high to throw dirt, he risked a brain shot. If he didn't raise the berm high enough, the plunging fire from the mounted warriors would find him in the bottom of the pit. Sergeant Woodhull directed the construction, shouting over the noise of the guns and the labored breathing of the men. He assigned sectors of the perimeter. Rath and Harrington took the north and east. Dixon and Chapman took the south and west. They worked in a rhythm of panic. Stab, scoop, throw, pack. The wallow began to transform. The shallow bowl became a fortified pit. The berm grew higher, inch by agonizing inch, providing a definitive visual barrier against the horizon. The heat in the depression was stifling. The sun reflecting off the light-colored sand created an oven effect. The temperature at the bottom of the pit soared, likely exceeding 100 degrees. There was no breeze to cool them. The rim of the wallow blocked the wind while trapping the heat. The men were dehydrating rapidly. Their tongues swelled in their mouths and their lips cracked and bled. The exertion of digging under such conditions pushed their cardiovascular systems to the limit. Hearts hammered against ribs, threatening to burst. Dixon paused for a fraction of a second to check the field of fire. He peered through a small gap in the grass clumps on the rim. The warriors had dismounted and were creeping closer, using the tall grass as concealment. They were spread out in a wide circle, completely surrounding the position. The distance had closed. Some were now within 75 yards. Dixon grabbed his sharps, shook the sand from the breech block, and rested the heavy barrel on the newly formed dirt parapet. He sighted on a puff of smoke rising from a clump of sagebrush. He didn't see the warrior, but he knew the source of the fire. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, the boom deafening in the confined space of the wallow. The heavy .50 caliber slug tore through the brush. He didn't wait to see the effect. He racked the lever, ejected the casing, and reloaded. The priority was to let the enemy know that the target was still dangerous. They had to buy time to finish the digging. The digging continued, a desperate excavation of survival. The men's hands were raw and bleeding. Fingernails broke and tore against stones hidden in the soil. The skin on their palms blistered and peeled away, leaving raw, weeping flesh that mixed with the dirt. They did not stop. The pain of the hands was irrelevant compared to the threat of the bullets. They dug until the muscles in their arms seized with cramps, and then they forced them to move again. As the berm rose, the sense of immediate, instant death receded slightly, replaced by the grim reality of a siege. They were no longer exposed on a flat table, but they were trapped in a hole. The wallow offered protection from direct fire, but it offered no escape. They were pinned. The enemy knew exactly where they were. The warriors began to probe the defenses, firing from different angles to find gaps in the earthwork. A bullet struck the inside of the wallow, ricocheting off a rock and buzzing around the pit like an angry hornet before burying itself in the sand. Chapman, working on the southern rim, hit a patch of caliche, a calcium carbonate deposit almost as hard as concrete. His knife skidded off the surface, jarring his wrist. He cursed, shifting his position to find softer ground. The geology of the plains was fighting them as hard as the Comanche. They needed depth. They needed to get lower. Every inch they dug down was better than an inch built up, as the berm could be eroded by heavy fire. The separation from Private Smith, who lay mortally wounded back near the horse carcasses, hung over the group like a dark cloud. In the frantic sprint, the focus had been entirely on securing a defensible position. Smith, unable to run, had been left in the open, his body a crumpled shape in the distance. The men in the wallow could not see him from the bottom of the pit, but they knew he was there. The guilt of leaving a comrade, even out of absolute necessity, added a psychological weight to the physical burden of the digging. Harrington stopped digging to fire a volley from his carbine. He pumped 3 rounds toward a group of warriors attempting to rush the eastern flank. The rapid fire forced the attackers to dive for cover, halting their advance. The Springfield carbine was hot, the barrel radiating heat waves that distorted the air. Harrington blew the dust off the breech and resumed digging. The rotation of fire and labor became the new standard operating procedure. 1 man shot while 3 dug. Then they switched. The sheer relentlessness of the incoming fire was awe-inspiring. The air above the wallow was a constant slipstream of passing metal. The sound was a continuous hiss-thwack, hiss-thwack, hiss-thwack. The warriors were not conserving ammunition. They had an ample supply, likely procured from reservation traders or illicit dealers, and they were using it to keep the patrol pinned. The dirt of the berm was constantly churning, small geysers of dust erupting as bullets impacted the loose soil. Dixon noticed that the sand in the bottom of the wallow was slightly damp. It was not water, but it held the memory of moisture. This made the digging slightly easier than the surface crust, but it also meant the mud clung to their tools and hands, adding weight to every movement. He scraped a handful of the cool, damp earth and rubbed it on his forehead. A fleeting moment of relief against the scorching sun. The dimensions of the fort were small. 6 men, or rather the 5 who were currently present, filled the space. There was no room to stretch out. They lay curled against the sides, their legs tangled in the center. The intimacy of the space meant they could smell the sweat, the fear, and the gunpowder on each other. They could hear the shallow, rapid breathing of their companions. It was a shared coffin, and they were fighting to keep the lid from being nailed shut. Woodhull called for a status check on ammunition. The men patted their cartridge belts and pockets. They had a reasonable supply, but it was not infinite. The sprint from the horses had meant leaving the saddlebags behind. What they had on their persons was all they would have for the duration of the fight. Conservation was critical, yet suppression was essential. It was a delicate balance that Woodhull had to manage. "Make every shot tell," Woodhull ordered. "Don't fire unless you have a target." The digging slowed as the berm reached a height of roughly 18 inches. Combined with the natural depth of the wallow and the excavation of the interior, they now had a total cover of perhaps 3 feet. It was enough to protect a man lying prone or kneeling low. It was not enough to stand or move freely. They were troglodytes, creatures of the earth, living below the horizon line. The view from inside the wallow was restricted. All they could see was the rim of their own dirt pile and the blue sky above. To see the enemy, they had to expose themselves. This created a profound sense of isolation. They were blind to the larger movements of the battlefield. They had to rely on sound and quick peeks to build a mental map of the threat. The war cries seemed to come from everywhere, circling the pit, a sonic noose tightening around their necks. Rath's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the muscular failure of the digging. He flexed his fingers, trying to restore circulation. The adrenaline that had fueled the sprint and the initial excavation was beginning to fade, replaced by the crushing fatigue of the situation. The reality of the pain in his arm, grazed earlier, returned with a throbbing vengeance. He looked at the bloody tear in his shirt but did not bandage it. There was no time for medical aid. The noon hour stretched on, time dilating in the heat. Minutes felt like hours. The sun did not seem to move. It hung pinned to the zenith, mocking their thirst. The thirst was becoming a dominant sensation, overriding even the fear of death. The mucous membranes of their mouths were dry as parchment. Swallowing was difficult and painful. The thought of the canteens lying shattered or abandoned near the horses was a mental torture. Dixon used the butt of his knife to hammer a stake of sagebrush into the side of the berm, creating a small shelf for his loose cartridges. He arranged them in a row, the brass gleaming in the sun. He wanted them ready to hand, not fumbling in a pouch when the rush came. And he knew the rush would come. The digging was done for now. The fort was built. It was a crude, ugly scar on the prairie, a pile of dirt and desperation, but it was theirs. The warriors, seeing the fortification established, ceased their attempts to rush the position immediately. They settled into a rhythm of harassment, keeping the heads of the soldiers down while they planned their next move. The silence that fell between the volleys was heavy and ominous. It was the sound of the enemy thinking, calculating the cost of digging the white men out of their hole. Dixon looked at his companions. They were caked in dirt, their faces streaks of mud and sweat, their eyes wide and bright in the shadow of their hat brims. They looked like statues carved from the earth itself. They had transformed from riders into something primal. They were defenders of a 10-foot circle of sand. "We hold here," Dixon said, his voice flat and certain. "We don't move from here." The declaration was simple. There was nowhere else to go. The wallow was the end of the line. If they died, they would die here. If they lived, it would be because this dirt held. The digging tools were laid aside and the rifles were brought to the shoulder. The transition from construction to defense was complete. The Battle of the Buffalo Wallow had entered its static phase, a test of endurance that would measure the hardness of the men against the hardness of the plains. The Depression, once a place for bison to roll, was now a redoubt of the United States Army. It was a makeshift dirt fort built fast, built with blood and fear, standing defiant in the middle of a hostile ocean. The men settled in, watching the rim, waiting for the feathers to rise above the grass. Past the hour of 1 in the afternoon, the sun, now slightly past its zenith, seemed to pause in the sky, focusing its entire thermal output onto the 10-foot circle of the Buffalo Wallow. The temperature within the depression rose steadily, turning the sandy pit into a kiln. The air was stagnant, blocked by the earthen berm the men had so frantically constructed. While the berm stopped the bullets, it also stopped the wind, creating a pocket of dead air that held the heat of the bodies, the heat of the fired weapons, and the relentless radiation from above. The 6 men, now 5 effective combatants and 1 dying man lying distant in the grass, entered the most brutal phase of the engagement. The initial adrenaline of the sprint and the dig had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity regarding their situation. They were trapped in a kill zone. The area above the rim of the wallow was a plain of death. Any object that broke the horizon line was immediately subjected to a converging fire from over 100 rifles. The Kiowa and Comanche warriors had established a complete dominance of the exterior terrain, and they were content to wait, letting the sun and the thirst do the work that their bullets had started. Inside the wallow, the thirst began to assert itself as the primary torture. The canteen water was gone, lost with the horses or smashed by gunfire. The physiology of the men began to break down under the stress of extreme exertion and dehydration. Their mouths turned to sandpaper. Tongues swelled until they filled the oral cavity, making speech a slurred, painful effort. Saliva production ceased entirely. The dust from the digging and the continuous impacts of bullets on the berm coated their throats, creating a sensation of choking that could only be relieved by swallowing, which was physically impossible. Billy Dixon lay against the south wall of the pit, his eyes scanning the narrow strip of sky visible above the dirt. He knew the enemy was adjusting. The wild, chaotic riding of the morning had been replaced by a calculated siege. The warriors were seasoned fighters. They understood that the white men were going nowhere. They crept closer through the tall grass, belly crawling like snakes, pushing their rifles ahead of them. They sought angles, looking for any depression or rise that would allow them to fire down into the wallow. The silence of the afternoon was punctured periodically by the sharp crack of a rifle. These were not volleys, but sniper shots. A warrior would spot a hat brim or a shoulder, fire a single well-aimed round, and then roll to a new position. The bullets slapped into the berm with terrifying force, spraying sand into the faces of the defenders. Occasionally, a slug would skim the top of the earthwork and slap into the opposite wall of the pit, burying itself in the dirt inches from a man's leg. Amos Chapman was restless. The confinement of the wallow grated on his nerves. He was a man of action, accustomed to the mobility of the scout. He shifted his position frequently, trying to find a firing angle that would allow him to push the attackers back. His legs, stiff from the crouching and the digging, ached with a dull throb that he ignored. He moved to the western edge of the wallow, raising his head slightly to peer through a gap in the sagebrush stakes. "Keep down, Amos," Sergeant Woodhull rasped, his voice a dry croak. "They're watching the rim." Chapman grunted but didn't lower himself. He had spotted a warrior moving behind a clump of mesquite, perhaps 80 yards away. The target was tempting. If he could eliminate the forward observers, it might relieve the pressure. Chapman raised his heavy rifle, sliding the barrel over the dirt parapet. He took a fraction of a second to acquire the sight picture, the front blade settling on the dark shape in the brush. At that precise moment, the enemy fired. The warrior in the mesquite had been a decoy, or perhaps just one, of many eyes watching the pit. A shot rang out from a different angle, likely from a slight rise to the northwest. The heavy caliber slug, moving at over 1,000 feet per second, crossed the distance in a heartbeat. The bullet struck Chapman. It did not hit the center of mass, but slammed into his left leg just above the ankle. The impact was catastrophic. The projectile shattered the tibia and fibula, pulverizing the bone into fragments. The kinetic energy of the round spun Chapman around, throwing him violently back into the center of the wallow. He landed hard, his rifle flying from his hands. For a second there was silence. Then the pain registered. Chapman let out a low, guttural groan through clenched teeth. He didn't scream. The shock was too profound. He reached down, gripping his leg with both hands. The limb was twisted at an unnatural angle, the foot flopped to the side as if attached only by skin and fabric. The blood began to flow immediately, soaking through the heavy canvas of his trousers and pooling in the sand of the pit. Dixon scrambled across the small space, ignoring the spray of dirt from a follow-up shot that clipped the rim. He reached Chapman and saw the devastation. The leg was destroyed. It was the kind of wound that killed men on the frontier, not from the trauma itself, but from the shock and the infection that followed. But right now, the danger was exsanguination. "Help me here," Dixon hissed to Rath. Private Rath crawled over, his face pale beneath the dirt. Together they worked to staunch the flow. There were no tourniquets, no bandages. They used what they had. Dixon pulled a large handkerchief from his pocket, already grimy with sweat and dust. He twisted it into a rope and tied it tightly around Chapman's leg just below the knee, trying to cut off the arterial pressure. He used the barrel of a pistol to wind the cloth tight, compressing the vessels against the remaining bone structure. Chapman's face went gray, the color draining away as the body shunted blood to the core. He clamped his jaw shut, his eyes rolling back in his head, but he remained conscious. The toughness of the man was evident. He refused to cry out, knowing that the sound of pain would only encourage the enemy. He breathed in short, sharp gasps, his chest heaving. "I'm all right," Chapman whispered, the lie evident to everyone. "Just a scratch. Give me my gun." Dixon handed him the rifle, but Chapman couldn't hold it steady. The pain was a living thing, radiating up his leg and clouding his mind. He slumped back against the dirt wall, his hand resting on the receiver of the weapon. He was out of the fight as a mobile combatant. The defense of the Wallow was now down to 4 able-bodied men. The injury to Chapman changed the dynamic in the pit. The smell of fresh blood, metallic and sharp, mixed with the smell of dry earth and spent powder. The flies, which had been buzzing around the horse carcasses, sensed the new source of nourishment. They descended on the Wallow in a black cloud, landing on Chapman's leg, on the men's faces, on their hands. The soldiers had to constantly brush them away, adding another layer of torment to the ordeal. The warriors, seemingly sensing that they had drawn blood, intensified their fire. They began to lob arrows high into the air, using the trajectory to drop the missiles vertically into the pit. The arrows fell with a terrifying randomness. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a shaft of wood and iron was vibrating in the sand floor between their legs. One arrow struck the stock of Woodhull's carbine, splintering the wood. Another grazed the shoulder of Harrington's tunic, tearing the fabric but missing the flesh. Dixon knew they had to respond. They couldn't just sit and take the punishment. He picked up his sharps and moved to a new position on the south wall. He needed to make the enemy pay for every inch of ground. He saw a warrior boldly standing up to fire, confident that the soldiers were suppressed. Dixon didn't hesitate. He snapped the rifle up, acquired the target, and fired. The big 50 roared. The warrior collapsed, dropping his rifle. "They're getting bold," Dixon said, reloading. "We have to keep them honest." The men fell into a grim rhythm. They conserved their ammunition, firing only when they had a clear target or when the movement in the grass became too threatening. They rotated positions, checking all points of the compass. The sun continued its slow, agonizing crawl across the sky. 2 o'clock became 3 o'clock. The heat did not abate. If anything, the angle of the sun allowed it to penetrate deeper under the brims of their hats, burning their faces and blinding them with glare. The thirst was now a physical agony. Private Wrath began to cramp. His leg muscles knotted hard, forcing him to stretch out in the cramped space, kicking dust into the faces of the others. He massaged the muscle, grimacing. The lack of water was thickening their blood, making their hearts work harder to pump the sludge through their veins. They began to hallucinate slightly. Patches of shimmering heat on the horizon looked like pools of water. The sound of the wind in the grass sounded like a running stream. Woodhull checked his pocket watch. It was a mechanical habit, a tether to civilization. The ticking of the watch was the only orderly thing in their chaotic world. 3:15. They had been in the Wallow for over 3 hours. It felt like 3 years. The realization that relief was not coming was absolute. Colonel Miles was miles away to the north. Camp Supply was days away to the east. They were alone on the planet. The psychological warfare from the Comanche continued. They shouted names, they shook scalps taken in previous raids. They mimicked the bugle calls of the cavalry, blowing crude notes on captured instruments. It was a tactic designed to break the spirit, to make the men feel the hopelessness of their position. But the effect was the opposite. It hardened the resolve of the defenders. The insults fueled a cold, quiet rage. They weren't going to die to give these men a trophy. Chapman, despite his agony, remained lucid. He directed the younger soldiers, pointing out likely approaches. His experience as a scout was invaluable. He knew how the tribes fought. He knew they would try to get close enough to rush before sunset. The twilight would be the most dangerous time. If they could get within 20 yards before the light failed, they would swarm the pit. "Watch that wash to the east," Chapman gritted out. "They'll come up that cut." Harrington shifted his fire to the east, putting a couple of rounds into the depression Chapman had indicated. A yelp of surprise and the movement of grass confirmed the scout's intuition. A group of warriors had been using the wash to flank them. The shots forced them back. The injury to Chapman's leg began to swell. The boot was becoming a constriction device. Dixon knew he should cut it off, but exposing the wound to the dirt and flies seemed worse. He loosened the laces as much as he dared. Chapman took a swig of air, his eyes squeezed shut. The pain was a constant rhythmic wave that washed over him with every heartbeat. Inside the kill zone, the margin for error was 0. A raised head meant death. A jammed gun meant death. A moment of panic meant death. The men moved with a deliberate slowness, checking every action. They wiped the sweat from their eyes before aiming. They shielded the breeches of their rifles from the blowing sand. They were technicians of survival operating in a hostile environment. The ground around the wallow was littered with the debris of the siege. Thousands of bullets had been fired at them. The dirt was seeded with lead. The grass was shredded. The air was heavy with the smell of sulfur. It was a landscape of violence, and in the center of it 6 men, 5 in the hole, 1 on the grass, held on. The plight of Private Smith lying out in the open became a gnawing worry for the group. They couldn't see him from the bottom of the pit, but they knew he was there. Was he dead? Was he suffering? The thought of him alone, exposed to the sun and the knives of the enemy, was unbearable. But to leave the wallow to check on him was suicide. The air above the rim was still thick with danger. Dixon looked at Chapman's shattered leg, then at the empty expanse where Smith lay. He looked at the faces of Rath and Harrington, young men aged 10 years in a single day. He looked at Woodhull, the sergeant trying to maintain command of a situation that had spiraled beyond any military manual. They were a ragged, broken unit, but they were still a unit. As 4 o'clock approached, the sun began to lose some of its vertical intensity, but the heat remained. The shadows began to lengthen slightly, offering a promise of evening that was still hours away, leading to nightfall. The siege showed no sign of lifting. The warriors were patient. They had the water. They had the food. They had the numbers. They were content to let the kill zone do its work. The men in the wallow checked their ammunition again. The piles of cartridges were shrinking. They had enough for a few more hours of sustained fighting, but not forever. They had to make every shot count. The discipline of fire was their lifeline. If the guns went silent, the rush would come. Dixon rested his forehead against the cool earth of the berm for a moment. He closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the fight, the snap of bullets, the buzz of flies, the ragged breathing of Chapman. This was their reality. The world had shrunk to this pit. The past was gone. The future was a question mark. There was only the now, the heat, and the enemy. The kill zone was not just the physical space, it was the psychological state. They were living in the space between life and death, walking the razor's edge. Every breath was a victory. Every minute survived was a triumph. They dug their toes into the sand, gripped their rifles, and waited for the next move. Later afternoons stretched into a prolonged exercise in endurance as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Inside the Buffalo Wallow, the situation regarding their defensive capabilities had shifted from precarious to critical. While the earthen berm provided a physical barrier against the incoming projectiles, the ability of the 5 men to return fire was diminishing with every squeeze of a trigger. Sergeant Woodhull performed a tactile inventory of the remaining ammunition, his fingers brushing against the canvas loops of his cartridge belt. The spaces where the brass casing should have been were largely empty. The sustained volley fire required to repel the earlier charges and the suppressing shots needed to keep the snipers at bay had drained their reserves at an alarming rate. Woodhull looked at Billy Dixon and Amos Chapman, his face grim beneath the mask of dust and dried sweat. He did not need to speak the words for the scouts to understand the logistics of their mortality. Without ammunition, the Sharps and Springfield rifles were nothing more than heavy clubs, useless against a mounted enemy armed with bows and repeating Winchesters. The realization settled over the group that their lifeline lay not in the pit with them, but out on the open prairie, strapped to the body of Private George W. Smith. Smith lay approximately 100 yards to the northeast, near the bloating carcasses of the horses where the initial stand had taken place. Through the gaps in the sagebrush atop the berm, Dixon could see the dark shape of the soldier in the grass. Occasionally, a limb would move, a slow, agonizing shift of position that signaled Smith was still clinging to life. More importantly, Smith was wearing a fully loaded cartridge belt, and his carbine saddlebags, likely containing extra boxes of .45 caliber rounds, were undoubtedly near him. The survival of the 5 men in the wallow depended entirely on retrieving those supplies. The distance between the wallow and Smith was a flat, coverless expanse of killing ground. To cross it was to invite the attention of every warrior in the circle. However, the alternative was to wait until their hammers clicked on empty chambers, followed by the inevitable rush of knives. The calculation was simple: risk death to fetch the tools of life, or wait for death to come for them. Dixon shifted his position, checking the action of his Sharps. He looked at Private Rath, who was crouched near the eastern rim, his eyes fixed on the distant figure of Smith. Rath was young, but the day had stripped away any youthful hesitation. He nodded at Dixon, a silent agreement that the task had to be done. They could not send Chapman; his shattered leg rendered him immobile. Woodhull and Harrington needed to maintain the perimeter defense, providing a volume of fire that would distract the enemy during the attempt. "We have to go now," Dixon said, his voice raspy, "before the light changes." The plan was crude. There was no tactic to disguise a man running in the open. Woodhull and Harrington would open fire on the known warrior positions to the north and west, hoping to suppress the enemy riflemen for a few precious seconds. Under that cover, Dixon and Rath would sprint to Smith, grab him and the ammunition, and drag everything back to the depression. Speed was their only armor. Woodhull gave the signal. He and Harrington rose slightly, exposing their heads and shoulders to the risk of incoming fire, and began to pump rounds downrange. The sudden eruption of fire from the wallow caught the warriors off guard, forcing heads down behind rocks and in the grass. In that momentary lull, Dixon and Rath vaulted over the earthen berm. They hit the ground running. Dixon moved with the long, loping stride of a man accustomed to traversing the plains, while Rath pumped his arms furiously, driving his boots into the dry soil. The air, which had been relatively still, suddenly felt thick and resistant. They were leaving the sanctuary of the earth and entering the domain of the bullet. For the first 20 yards, there was no reaction from the enemy. The warriors were reacting to the covering fire. Then the realization struck the Comanche line. 2 white men were in the open. The suppression fire from the wallow could not silence 100 guns. The return fire began as a few scattered shots and quickly swelled into a crescendo. The ground around Dixon and Rath began to erupt. Little geysers of dirt spat up around their feet. The air hissed with the passage of slugs. A bullet tugged at Dixon's shirt sleeve, snapping the fabric but missing the skin. He did not flinch. His eyes were locked on Smith. The 100 yards felt infinite. The physical exertion of sprinting after hours of dehydration and combat caused their hearts to hammer against their ribs. Their lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that the hot, dusty air could barely provide. Every step was a gamble, against probability. They were two moving targets on a static field running through a storm of ballistics. They reached Smith, sliding into the grass beside him to minimize their profiles. The soldier was in a horrific state. The lung wound had bled profusely, soaking the front of his uniform in a dark, sticky, heavy substance. His face was the color of ash, his eyes glazed and unfocused. He looked at Dixon with a mixture of confusion and relief, his lips moving without sound. A pink froth bubbled at the corner of his mouth with every shallow, gurgling breath. "We got you, John," Rath gasped, his chest heaving. "We're going back." Dixon didn't waste time with words. He grabbed Smith's cartridge belt, checking to ensure it was secure. He spotted the saddlebags lying in the dirt a few feet away, the leather torn but the contents intact. He snatched them up and slung them over his shoulder. The weight of the ammunition was significant, a burden of brass and destruction that they desperately needed. "Grab his legs," Dixon ordered Rath. "I'll take the shoulders." They couldn't run back. Smith was dead weight, 160 pounds of limp humanity. To stand up and carry him was impossible. It would present too large a target. They had to drag him, staying as low as possible, moving at a crouch. Dixon grabbed the collar of Smith's tunic and the straps of his suspenders. Rath hooked his arms under Smith's knees. "Heave!" Dixon grunted. They lifted the wounded man inches off the ground and began the return journey. The movement was agonizingly slow. They crab-walked backward, their boots slipping on the slick grass. Smith groaned, a low, pitiable sound as his broken body was jostled. The pain must have been absolute, but there was no option for gentleness. The warriors saw the slow-moving group and concentrated their fire. The volume of incoming rounds increased. The bullets were no longer random, they were aimed. The ground around them was being chewed up. A slug struck the heel of Smith's boot, spinning his leg out of Rath's grip. Rath stumbled, cursing, and grabbed the limb again. Another round struck the ground between Dixon's legs, spraying sand into his eyes. He blinked the grit away, refusing to let go of the tunic. "Cover fire!" Dixon screamed toward the wallow, though he knew Woodhull could not hear him over the din. But Woodhull saw. From the wallow, the sergeant and Harrington were firing as fast as they could load, their barrels smoking. They were trying to build a wall of noise and danger to protect their comrades. Amos Chapman, despite his shattered leg, had pulled himself up to the rim, resting his rifle on the dirt, adding his heavy-caliber shots to the defense. The return trip was a nightmare of physical mechanics. The muscles in Dixon's back and arms screamed in protest. The heat of the sun combined with the exertion made him dizzy. Black spots danced in his vision. He focused on the rim of the wallow. That pile of dirt was the only thing in the world that offered safety. It looked miles away, though it was only 80 yards, then 60, then 40. Every yard gained was a battle against friction and gravity. Smith's body caught on clumps of sagebrush and rocks. They had to yank him free, the violent motion eliciting fresh bubbles of blood from his chest. The smell of the blood was overpowering, a metallic tang that coated the back of Dixon's throat. At 30 yards, a bullet struck the saddlebag on Dixon's shoulder. The impact spun him halfway around, nearly knocking him off his feet. He felt the heavy blow but didn't feel the bite of the bullet. The rounds inside the bag had absorbed the energy, saving his spine. He righted himself, readjusted his grip, and kept pulling. "Almost there!" Rath yelled, his voice cracking. "Keep moving!" The warriors began to stand up, trying to get better angles. They sensed that the prey was escaping back into the hole. Arrows began to fall around the retrieving party, silent missiles that thudded ominously into the turf. One arrow pierced the loose fabric of Smith's trousers, pinning the cloth to the ground. Rath ripped the fabric free, tearing the wool. 10 yards. The faces of the men in the wallow were visible now, masks of tension and fear. Woodhull was shouting encouragement, waving them in. Harrington was firing so rapidly that he was fumbling with the cartridges, his hands shaking. With a final, desperate surge of energy, Dixon and Rath threw themselves toward the lip of the wallow. They dragged Smith up the slight incline of the exterior slope and tumbled over the berm. They landed in a heap at the bottom of the pit, a tangle of limbs, rifles, and ammunition. Smith landed hard, letting out a sharp gasp before falling silent. For a moment, nobody moved. The men lay in the dirt, chests heaving, lungs sucking in the hot air in great, ragged gulps. They were alive. They had made the run, grabbed the prize, and returned. The sheer improbability of their survival hung in the air. Dixon rolled onto his back, staring up at the blue square of sky. He was covered in dust and Smith's blood. His arms trembled uncontrollably. He reached up and touched the saddlebag still slung across his chest. It was there. The ammunition was safe. Woodhull crawled over, ignoring the bullets that were still snapping over the rim. He grabbed the canteen from Smith's belt. It was empty, shot through during the earlier fight. He cursed silently but turned his attention to the ammunition. He unbuckled the cartridge belt from Smith's waist and opened the saddlebags. "Gold," Woodhull whispered. "Pure gold." He began to distribute the rounds. Handfuls of .45 caliber cartridges were passed to Rath and Harrington. Dixon took the heavy .50 caliber rounds for his sharps, though Smith's supply was mostly for the carbines. The tactile sensation of the fresh brass was reassuring. It was weight. It was power. It was the ability to say no to the death waiting outside. They turned their attention to Smith. He was lying on his side, curled into a fetal position. The journey had been brutal on his damaged body. The bleeding had increased. His breathing was shallow and rapid, a terrifying rattle that filled the small space of the wallow. His eyes were open, but they were looking at things far beyond the dirt walls of the fort. "John," Dixon said softly, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "You're in. You're safe." Smith's eyes flickered toward Dixon. A faint spark of recognition appeared. He tried to speak, but the blood in his airway choked the words. He managed a weak nod. He was safe from the knives, yes, but the internal damage was catastrophic. The bullet had done too much. The presence of the dying man in the confined space changed the atmosphere. Before, death was an external threat, something flying over the rim. Now, death was in the pit with them. It was sitting in the corner waiting. The sounds of Smith's struggle, the wet gasps, the gurgles became the soundtrack to their defense. Chapman, from his position against the wall, looked at Smith. 2 wounded men, one likely fatal, one crippling. The toll was mounting. Chapman's own leg was a throbbing mass of agony, but seeing Smith made him grit his teeth harder. At least he could still hold a rifle. Smith was done. The retrieval had been a success, but the cost was the energy and the psychological burden of watching a friend die by inches. The sun continued its march. It was now late afternoon, approaching 5 o'clock. The shadows inside the wallow grew longer, offering a sliver of shade against the eastern wall. The warriors, frustrated by the successful retrieval, poured a fresh volume of fire into the berm. They knew the soldiers had resupplied. The intensity of the siege ramped up. They shouted insults, their voices carrying clearly on the evening air. They knew the night was coming, and with it, new opportunities. Dixon loaded his sharps with a fresh cartridge from the retrieved horde. He slid the breech block up, feeling the solid lock of the mechanism. He crawled to the rim, finding a gap in the dirt. He was tired, bone-weary, and thirsty beyond description. But he had bullets. He saw a warrior standing on a ridgeline, waving a blanket. Dixon settled the sights. He didn't feel the recoil this time. He just watched the warrior drop. "We have enough to hold until dark," Dixon said, his voice steady. "And then?" Harrington asked, wiping his eyes. "And then we hold until morning," Dixon replied. The retrieval of Private Smith was the turning point of the afternoon. It secured the means of resistance. It brought the patrol back together, physically if not effectively. They were all in the hole now. The circle was complete. The dirt fort held the living and the dying, united in a stubborn refusal to be erased from the plains. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red, the men settled in. They arranged the ammunition boxes like precious jewels. They checked Smith's bandages, though there was little they could do. They drank the last drops of adrenaline and prepared for the long, dark wait. The retrieval was over. The night siege was about to begin. As the early evening hours approached the sun, a relentless orb that had dictated the terms of the engagement for the entire day began to slide toward the western horizon. Its angle shifted, casting long, distorted shadows across the buffalo grass, stretching the silhouettes of the sagebrush into dark fingers that pointed toward the besieged depression. Inside the 10-foot circle of the wallow, the atmosphere had undergone a fundamental transformation. The frantic energy of the dig and the desperate, breathless scramble of the retrieval had settled into a cold, hard calcification of resolve. The retrieval of the ammunition from Private Smith's body had not just provided the physical means to fight. It had restored the psychological equilibrium of the 5 conscious men. They were no longer helpless targets waiting for the knife. They were heavily armed combatants in a fortified position, possessing enough brass cartridges to exact a ruinous toll on anyone foolish enough to cross the open ground. Billy Dixon settled himself against the southern rim of the berm, the dirt now packed solid by the weight of their bodies and the impacts of enemy fire. He held the Sharp's buffalo rifle with a familiarity born of years on the commercial hunt. The weapon was heavy, its octagon barrel thick and unwavering. It was chambered for a .50 caliber cartridge, a massive round designed to drop a 2,000-pound bison with a single impact. Against a human target, the ballistics were devastating. Dixon checked the sights, adjusting the vernier scale for the range. The warriors had pulled back, respecting the lethal radius of the wallow, but they remained within 300 to 400 yards, a distance they believed rendered them relatively safe from the carbines. They were mistaken regarding the capabilities of the Sharps. The Kiowa and Comanche fighters, frustrated by their inability to overrun the small group during the chaotic melee of the morning, had resorted to a siege of attrition. They knew the white men had no water. They knew the heat was a torture. They sat on their ponies or crouched in the grass, watching the dirt pile, waiting for the inevitable weakening of the defense. Every so often, a warrior would ride out, guiding his pony in a wide arc, shaking a shield or a lance, shouting insults to provoke a response. It was a display of courage and dominance, a way to count coup without making contact. Dixon watched one such rider, a man on a spotted pony who was galloping back and forth along a ridgeline to the west. The rider was perhaps 600 yards away, a difficult shot for a standard military rifle, but well within the effective envelope of the buffalo gun. Dixon rested the heavy barrel on the earthen parapet, settling the forend into a groove he had worn in the dirt. He slowed his breathing, ignoring the parched agony of his throat. He waited for the rider to turn, to present a broader profile. The rider wheeled his pony, pausing for a brief second to shout a challenge. Dixon squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell, igniting the massive powder charge. The rifle roared, a deep, resonant boom that differed physically from the crack of the Springfields. The recoil shoved Dixon's shoulder back, a heavy, solid push. A dense cloud of white, sulfurous smoke erupted from the muzzle, momentarily obscuring the view. Dixon racked the lever, the extractor clawing the hot, expanded brass casing from the chamber and flinging it into the sand. He peered through the dissipating smoke. The spotted pony was galloping away, riderless. A dark shape lay motionless in the grass on the ridge. The distance had been conquered by velocity and mass. The display of marksmanship sent a ripple of caution through the enemy lines. The warriors who had been casually exposing themselves dropped into the grass. The circle widened perceptibly. The wallow was no longer just a hole. It was a fortress with a reach that defied the standard rules of engagement. Amos Chapman, despite the catastrophic injury to his leg, refused to be a passive observer. He had propped himself up against the wall of the pit, his shattered limb extended before him, the blood-soaked handkerchief tourniquet black with dried gore. His face was gray, the lines of pain etched deep around his eyes and mouth, but his hands remained steady enough to operate his weapon. He held a rifle similar in power to Dixon's. He watched the eastern sector, covering the approaches from the wash where the warriors had tried to flank them earlier. "They don't like the big ones," Chapman grunted, his voice a dry rasp. "They know the sound." The psychological impact of the heavy rifles was the turning point. The volume of incoming fire from the tribes began to slacken. They were no longer willing to waste ammunition on a target that bit back with such ferocity. Instead, they focused on keeping the patrol pinned, relying on the sun and the thirst to finish the job. The taunts continued, however. A warrior with a powerful voice lay hidden in a clump of plum bushes, yelling in broken English. He called them women. He described in graphic detail what would happen when the sun went down. He told them their scalps were already claimed. Sergeant Woodhull, crouching near the center of the pit to distribute the ammunition more evenly, listened to the insults with a stone face. He knew the purpose of the noise. It was intended to break their nerve, to make them waste shots on invisible targets. He signaled Rath and Harrington to hold their fire. They had the rounds now, but discipline was still the order of the day. "Let them talk," Woodhull whispered. "Words don't kill. Save the powder for meat." Private Smith lay in the bottom of the wallow, the space cramped with his presence. His breathing had become a wet, rhythmic gargle that filled the silence between shots. The fluid in his lungs was slowly drowning him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and occasionally mumbling names of people who were not there. His suffering was a constant, heavy presence that weighed on the survivors. They tried to make him comfortable, arranging a bedroll under his head, but there was nothing to be done for the thirst or the pain. Smith's eyes, when they opened, were glassy and fixed on the sky, watching the clouds that had begun to form in the north. The thirst was becoming a hallucination. The membranes of their mouths were so dry they stuck together. Swallowing was a convulsing effort that brought no relief. The image of the Canteen Creek miles away, or the muddy water of the Canadian River, played in their minds. They looked at the bloody mud on Chapman's leg, at the damp earth they had dug up from the bottom of the wallow. Some of the men put pebbles in their mouths to stimulate saliva flow, but the glands were dry. They were drying out from the inside, their blood thickening, their thoughts becoming slow and syrup-like. Yet the adrenaline of the fight kept them functioning. The threat of immediate violence sharpened their senses even as their bodies failed. Harrington, who had been a clerk before enlisting, found a reserve of aggression he didn't know he possessed. He sat by the rim, his carbine ready, scanning the grass for the slightest movement. He saw a feather rise above a tuft of sagebrush 50 yards out. He didn't wait for orders, he fired. The bullet clipped the brush and the feather disappeared. "Stay down!" Harrington yelled, his voice cracking. The warriors began to employ a captured bugle. Somewhere in the tall grass, a Comanche blew a series of discordant, mocking notes. He mimicked the charge and the recall, turning the familiar military signals into a grotesque parody. The sound was eerie, drifting across the empty prairie, a reminder that the enemy knew their procedures, knew their habits. It was a sound of civilization twisted into a weapon of savagery about the situation. Dixon ignored the bugle. He was focused on a group of warriors attempting to salvage the tack from the dead horses. The carcasses lay in the open, buzzing with flies, but the saddles and bridles were valuable prizes. A warrior sprinted from cover, diving behind the swollen body of the gray horse Smith had ridden. He began to cut at the cinch. Dixon adjusted his aim. He couldn't see the man, only the movement of the horse's body as the warrior tugged at the saddle. Dixon aimed slightly above the curve of the dead horse's belly, calculating the angle. He fired. The heavy slug punched through the carcass and the warrior behind it. The man screamed a high, sharp sound that was cut short. He did not emerge. The looting stopped. The perimeter was absolute. The message was clear. Anything within range of the sharps belonged to the dead. As 6 o'clock arrived, the heat began to shift. The direct vertical pressure of the sun lessened, but the angle of the light created a new hazard. The sun was now directly in their eyes if they looked west, a blinding glare that turned the prairie into a sheet of gold and fire. The warriors to the west used this, popping up to fire while the soldiers were squinting into the brilliance. Woodhull ordered the men to pull their hat brims low, to observe through the smallest possible slits. The dirt of the wallow, which had been loose and sandy, was now mixed with empty brass casings, torn paper patches from the cartridges, and the blood of 2 men. It was a gritty, filthy nest. The smell was a compound of nitrate, iron, sweat, and the beginning of decomposition from the horses downwind. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse. Chapman shifted, his boots scraping against the dirt. The pain in his leg was changing from a sharp agony to a dull, throbbing, toxic heat. The swelling was significant, straining the fabric of his trousers. He needed water to help his body fight the shock. But there was none. He looked at Dixon. "Billy," Chapman whispered, "if they rush us in the dark—" "They won't," Dixon said, not looking away from the sights. "We hurt them too bad. They'll wait." Dixon's assessment was correct. The Kiowa and Comanche were pragmatic fighters. They did not throw lives away on a frontal assault against an entrenched enemy who was shooting straight. They had lost too many men already. The cost of the scalps in the wallow had become too high. They would wait for the night to cover their movements, or they would wait for the thirst to kill the men for them. The firing from the enemy positions became sporadic. It was no longer the furious storm of the morning or the steady suppression of the afternoon. It was a harassment fire, a reminder that the cage was still locked. A bullet would thwack into the berm every few minutes just to keep the heads down. Rath took the opportunity to clean his carbine. The black powder fouling had built up in the barrel and the action, making the weapons sluggish. He used a piece of his shirt tail and his own saliva, what little he could muster, to wipe the breech block. He ran a rod down the barrel, pushing out the caked soot. It was a necessary maintenance. A jammed gun in a night fight was a death sentence. The sun touched the horizon line. The sky exploded into color, deep purples, bruised reds, and vibrant oranges. It was a sunset of spectacular beauty, indifferent to the misery in the pit. The light faded rapidly, the golden glare giving way to a gray twilight. The visibility dropped. The distant ridges dissolved into the background. The danger zone shrank. With the fading light, the temperature began to drop. The blistering heat of the day evaporated, radiating back into the atmosphere. The sweat on their shirts began to cool, sending shivers through their exhausted frames. The change was welcome at first, a relief from the oven, but the men knew the nights on the plains could be mercilessly cold. Dixon reloaded the sharps one last time by the dying light. He placed a fresh percussion cap on the nipple, ensuring it was seated firmly. He arranged his remaining cartridges on the dirt shelf he had carved. He had fired dozens of rounds. His shoulder was a mass of purple bruising, stiff and sore. His ears rang with a permanent tinnitus from the concussion of the big gun in the confined space. The warriors began to signal to each other with owl hoots and coyote yips. The sounds circled the wallow, moving closer as the darkness deepened. They were closing the net for the night. The visual dominance of the rifle was ending. The auditory dominance of the stalker was beginning. Woodhull spoke to the group, his voice low. "Stay awake. Listen to the grass. If you hear a rustle, shoot." Smith groaned loudly, thrashing his legs. "Water," he rasped. "Please." There was no water. The denial was the hardest part of the ordeal. To hear a dying man beg for the one thing you could not give him was a specialized form of torture. Dixon reached over and squeezed Smith's hand. The soldier's skin was hot and dry, like parchment paper left in the sun. The tide had turned in the sense that they were no longer being overrun. They had established a zone of denial. They had forced the enemy to respect their position. But the siege was far from over. The night brought a new set of terrors. The invisibility of the enemy, the cold, the thirst, the silence. Dixon looked at the northern sky. The clouds he had noticed earlier were building. They were dark, heavy, and moving fast. A different kind of storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with the Comanche. The air pressure was dropping. The static electricity in the air made the hair on his arms stand up. "Weather coming," Chapman noted, looking up. "Might bring rain," Rath said, hope in his voice. "Might bring hell," Dixon replied. The twilight deepened into true night. The stars were obscured by the approaching cloud bank. The darkness in the wallow was absolute. The men strained, their eyes looking for the darker shapes of crawling warriors against the dark grass. They held their breath, listening. The wind began to pick up, rustling the dry vegetation, masking the sound of any approach. The turning tide had bought them time. It had bought them the sunset. But it had not bought them safety. They were 5 men and a corpse in a dirt hole, surrounded by an army as the world turned black around them. The rifle barrels were still hot, but the air was getting cold. The battle of bullets was pausing. The battle of the elements was about to begin. Dixon kept his finger on the trigger of the sharps. He didn't know what the night would bring, but he knew he would meet it with 50 caliber of heavy metal. The wallow was their castle, and they would hold it until the walls crumbled or the last man fell. Evening plunged into a darkness that was absolute and terrifyingly volatile. The twilight had faded, swallowed by a massive bruised wall of clouds that advanced from the northwest, blotting out the stars and extinguishing the faint celestial navigation points the men had relied upon. The oppressive heat that had defined the battle for the previous 10 hours did not dissipate slowly. It was violently shoved aside by a meteorological phenomenon specific to the southern plains. The air pressure plummeted with a physical intensity that popped the ears of the 5 survivors huddled in the Buffalo Wallow. The stillness of the evening, which had briefly allowed the sounds of the circling Comanche to drift clearly across the grass, was shredded by a sudden rising roar of wind that sounded like a freight train derailment tearing across the open prairie. The wind struck the wallow first, a gale-force blast carrying a suspended wall of grit, dry grass, and sand. It hit the northern face of the earthen berm with a force that scoured the dirt and whipped the hats from the heads of the men. They ducked low, pressing their faces into the crook of their arms to shield their eyes from the abrasive assault. The temperature crashed. In the span of 30 minutes, the mercury fell from the 90s to near freezing. The sweat that had soaked their wool shirts and canvas trousers during the heat of the day instantly turned cold, clammy, and dangerous. The rapid evaporation chilled their skin, sending uncontrollable shivers through their exhausted frames. This was the Blue Norther, a savage cold front that could kill exposed livestock and men as efficiently as any rifle bullet. Billy Dixon felt the change in the air and knew the implications were dire. They had no coats. Their heavy winter gear, slickers, and blankets were strapped to the saddles of the dead horses lying 100 yards away in the darkness or scattered across the prairie during the initial stampede. They were clad, only in their light campaign uniforms, fabrics designed to breathe in the heat, not insulate against a freeze. The wind cut through the material as if it were gauze. Dixon huddled against the south bank of the pit, trying to use the earthwork as a windbreak, but the gale swirled into the depression, creating a vortex of biting air that found every gap in his clothing. Then the rain came. It did not start as a drizzle, but as a deluge, a horizontal sheet of water driven by the 60-mile-per-hour wind. The rain was freezing cold, bordering on sleet. It hammered the ground, turning the dry, baked dust of the wallow into instant mud. The impact of the water on the men was shocking. It soaked them to the bone within seconds, plastering their hair to their skulls and filling their boots with icy liquid. The physical shock of the cold water on their overheated, dehydrated bodies caused their muscles to seize and cramp. However, the rain brought a single desperate mercy. It was water. The thirst that had been torturing them for hours, swelling their tongues and cracking their lips, could finally be addressed. As the water began to pool in the bottom of the depression, mixing with the sand, the blood of Amos Chapman and Private Smith, and the horse manure that was naturally present in a buffalo wallow, the men did not hesitate. They cupped their hands, catching the falling rain. They took off their hats, letting the brims fill, and drank greedily. The water was filthy. It was a slurry of mud and bodily fluids, cold and gritty. To a man in civilization, it would have been a repulsive, toxic substance. To the men in the wallow, it was life. Dixon drank from a puddle forming near his elbow, the grit crunching between his teeth. The liquid soothed his parched throat, loosening the mucus that had made breathing difficult. He saw Private Wrath and Private Harrington doing the same, lapping at the mud like wild animals. The relief was immediate, even as the cold gripped their intestines. The dehydration began to reverse, clearing the fog from their minds, sharpening their senses even as their bodies began to succumb to the thermal assault. The storm had an immediate tactical effect on the siege. The Kiowa and Comanche warriors, exposed on the open grass without the benefit of the depression, could not maintain their positions. The wind made aiming a rifle impossible, blowing the powder residue back into the shooter's eyes and destabilizing the flight of arrows. The rain rendered the flintlock muskets and bowstrings useless. The cold forced the warriors to seek shelter. They retreated to the ravines and washouts, huddling under their buffalo robes and blankets, abandoning the immediate perimeter of the wallow. The gunfire ceased entirely. The only sound was the howling of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain. Inside the wallow, the environment became the new adversary. The depression, which had been their fortress, began to transform into a cistern. The water level rose steadily. The sandy loam of the bottom, packed hard by their boots, became a slick, viscous quagmire. The men could no longer lie down without being submerged in 3 inches of freezing sludge. They were forced to sit up, hugging their knees to their chests, trying to keep their core organs out of the water. Amos Chapman suffered the most. His shattered leg, bound tightly with the handkerchief tourniquet, throbbed with a renewed, agonizing intensity. The cold seeped into the open wound, biting at the exposed nerve endings and the splintered bone. The water in the pit soaked the fabric of his trousers, wicking the freezing moisture directly into the injury. He groaned through chattering teeth, his body shaking violently. The cold compromised his circulation further, turning his face a pale, waxy blue. "My leg!" Chapman gasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It's freezing!" Dixon moved closer to Chapman, pressing his shoulder against the scout's uninjured side. They had to share body heat. There was no other source of warmth. Woodhull, Wrath, and Harrington joined the huddle. They formed a tight knot of humanity in the center of the mud pit, their backs to the wind, their bodies interlocking to reduce the surface area exposed to the storm. They were 5 shivering, soaked men trying to keep the biological fires burning in a deluge. Private Smith lay slightly apart from the group. In the darkness and the confusion of the storm, he had stopped moving. The cold had accelerated the shock of his lung wound. His body, unable to generate heat, had surrendered. Dixon reached out and touched Smith's hand. It was ice cold, indistinguishable in temperature from the mud he lay in. Dixon felt for a pulse at the neck, pressing his fingers into the wet skin. There was nothing. The chest did not rise. The rattling breath had ceased, lost in the noise of the wind. "Smith is gone," Dixon said, his voice flat. There was no ceremony. There was no time for grief. The presence of the corpse became a grim utility. They could not move him out of the wallow. The exertion would cost too much energy, and they risked exposure. They left him where he lay, his body slowly sinking into the rising water. The reality of their situation was stripped of all sentiment. They were surviving next to the dead, and the dead man was now just an object in the fort. The rain turned to hail for a brief, violent interval. Small pellets of ice stung their faces and hands, bouncing off the mud and accumulating in the folds of their clothing. The hail added a new layer of misery, bruising their skin and lowering the temperature of the water in the pit even further. The physical pain of the cold was excruciating. Fingers became numb and useless. Manipulating the trigger guard of a rifle or the latch of a cartridge belt became a clumsy, impossible task. They had to keep their hands tucked into their armpits or between their thighs to preserve dexterity. Woodhull shouted to be heard, "We have to keep the powder dry. If the cartridges get wet, we're dead in the morning." This was a critical realization. The paper patches on the Sharp's ammunition and the primer seals on the carbine rounds were not waterproof. Prolonged submersion or exposure to the driving rain could ruin the powder charges. The men fumbled with their pockets and belts. They took off their hats and placed them over the piles of loose ammunition on the dirt shelf. They tucked the loaded weapons under their bodies, shielding the breeches with their own flesh. They were using their own freezing bodies as waterproofing for the tools of war. As the night wore on, the wind shifted slightly, coming more from the north. It brought with it a debris field of tumbleweeds. The large, thorny spheres of dry Russian thistle came rolling across the prairie, driven by the gale. They bounded over the grass, ghost-like shapes in the dark. Some of them slammed into the berm of the wallow. Others rolled right over the top. Dixon saw an opportunity. "Grab them!" he yelled. "Grab the weeds!" It was a stroke of frontier ingenuity. The men reached up, ignoring the thorns that tore at their numb hands, and snagged the tumbleweeds as they flew past. They pulled the prickly bushes into the wallow. They weren't using them for fire. There was no dry wood and no way to strike a match in this torrent. They used them as a roof. They piled the tumbleweeds on top of themselves, weaving the spiny branches together to create a crude, porous canopy. The tumbleweeds did not stop the rain, but they broke the wind. They created a layer of dead air above the men, trapping a fraction of the heat radiating from their bodies. It was a miserable, scratching blanket, but it provided a psychological and physical barrier against the open sky. Under the pile of weeds, the men huddled closer, their heads bowed, breathing into their shirts to warm the air before inhaling it. Hypothermia was the new enemy stalking the pit. It began to affect their minds. The shivering, which had been violent, began to subside in waves, replaced by a dangerous lethargy. A feeling of warmth, a false signal from a dying nervous system, tempted them to close their eyes and sleep. Dixon knew that to sleep was to die. If they drifted off, their core temperatures would drop past the point of no return. "Stay awake," Dixon shouted, nudging Rath hard in the ribs. "Talk to me. Keep talking." "It's cold," Rath mumbled, his speech slurred. "So cold." "Tell me about the barracks," Dixon demanded. Tell me what you ate for breakfast 2 days ago. Say anything. They forced a conversation, a disjointed, surreal exchange of trivialities shouted over the storm. They talked about food, about warm stoves, about girls in Dodge City. They pinched each other. They slapped their own faces. They fought the sleep with the same desperation they had fought the Comanche. The water in the wallow was now several inches deep. It was a red-brown soup. The blood from Smith's body had leached out, mixing with the flood. They were sitting in it, marinating in the remnants of the battle. The smell of iron and wet wool was overpowering. Every time they shifted, the cold water rushed into a new warm spot, sending a fresh shock through their systems. Chapman's condition deteriorated. He became delirious, muttering in a mix of English and the native tongues he spoke fluently. He was fighting his own battles in his fevered mind. Dixon kept a hand on Chapman's chest, feeling the erratic beat of the heart. He worried the scout wouldn't make the morning. The loss of blood combined with the thermal shock was a lethal combination. The hours stretched into an eternity. Midnight passed, marked only by the shifting position of the moon behind the clouds, which offered no light. The darkness was suffocating in its density. They couldn't see the horizon. They couldn't see the enemy. They could only feel the cold and hear the wind. The isolation was total. The entire world had shrunk to a 10-foot circle of mud and ice. Around 3 in the morning, the rain began to taper off, transitioning to a freezing mist. The wind remained high, but the deluge stopped. This presented a new problem: evaporative cooling. As the wind hit their soaked clothes, it froze the fabric stiff. Their sleeves became hard tubes of ice. Their trousers crinkled when they moved. They were encased in frozen armor that locked their limbs in place. Dixon tried to move his legs and found them unresponsive. He had to use his hands to physically lift his thigh to shift position. The circulation to his feet was practically non-existent. He knew they were all suffering from frostbite. The toes were numb blocks of wood. The pain would come later when they thawed, but for now the lack of sensation was terrifying. The silence from the prairie was unnerving. The storm had driven the wildlife to ground as well. There were no coyotes, no crickets. Just the wind hissing through the grass. The Comanche were out there somewhere, likely suffering just as much, huddled under wet blankets in a ravine. But the white men were trapped in the low ground, the natural collection point for the freezing water. Dixon checked his Sharps rifle. He ran his thumb over the breech block. It was slick with ice. He carefully broke the ice away, ensuring the hammer could fall. If the enemy attacked at first light, the guns had to work. He wiped the moisture from the sights, drying them on the driest patch of his undershirt he could find. They waited for the dawn. The concept of the sun, which had been their torturer the day before, became their desperate hope. They prayed for the heat. They prayed for the light. The passage of time was measured in shivering breaths. Every minute was a victory of endurance. As the pre-dawn gray began to dilute the blackness of the eastern sky, the full extent of their misery became visible. They looked like bog creatures. They were coated in mud from head to toe. Their eyes were red-rimmed and sunken in gaunt, pale faces. Their lips were blue. They were shaking uncontrollably, a collective vibration that rippled through the pile of tumbleweeds. Smith's body lay half submerged, his face washed clean by the rain, looking peaceful in the gray light. The water in the wallow was still, a dark mirror reflecting the gloomy sky. The ammunition boxes were sodden piles of cardboard, but the brass cartridges glinted dully. The storm had saved them from the thirst and the immediate assault, but it had nearly killed them with cold. It was a brutal trade-off. The Blue Norther had scoured the battlefield, resetting the board. Now, as the 12th of September gave way to the 13th, the 5 survivors faced the new day not as soldiers, but as frozen, battered remnants of men. They had survived the fire, and they had survived the ice, but they were brittle, pushed to the absolute limit of human resilience. Dixon pushed a tumbleweed aside and looked over the rim. The prairie was a sea of gray mist. The grass was flattened by the wind. The world looked dead. He pulled the tumbleweed back over his head and shivered, waiting for the sun to rise and thaw the blood in his veins. The night of the Blue Norther was over, but the ordeal was not. September 13th, 1874 arrived not with a bugle call, but with a silent, blinding brilliance that illuminated the wreckage of the Buffalo Wallow. The sun crested the eastern horizon, instantly engaging in a war with the remnants of the Blue Norther. The sky, scrubbed clean by the violence of the storm, was a piercing crystalline blue devoid of the clouds that had terrorized the men during the dark hours. The temperature began to swing wildly in the opposite direction. As the solar radiation struck the frozen prairie, the frost that coated the buffalo grass sparkled like crushed diamonds before melting into a heavy, clinging dew. Inside the depression, the pile of tumbleweeds that had served as a roof was now a soggy, dripping mess, trapping the humidity and the stench of the pit. Billy Dixon pushed the thorny branches aside, his movements stiff and jerky. The ice that had encased his sleeves cracked and fell away in sheets, revealing the sodden, mud-stained wool beneath. His joints felt fused together by the cold. Every articulation of his fingers or knees sent a sharp jolt of pain through his nervous system as the blood began to force its way back into the constricted capillaries. He looked around the circle. It was a tableau of misery. Private Rath and Private Harrington were huddled together, their faces pale and streaked with the charcoal of gunpowder and the brown of the mud. Their eyes were vacant, staring at nothing, their bodies trembling with the aftershocks of hypothermia. Amos Chapman was in a critical state. The scout lay half submerged in the reddish-brown sludge at the bottom of the wallow. His shattered leg was a swollen, discolored mass. The freezing water had likely saved him from bleeding to death by constricting the vessels, but it had also frozen the tissue. He was conscious, but his responses were delayed. His speech a meaningless mumble of delirium. Beside him lay the body of Private George W. Smith, the soldier, had stiffened in the night, his limbs locked in the final rigor of death. He was a silent companion, his open eyes washed clean by the rain, staring perpetually at the dirt wall of the berm. The sun climbed higher, and the heat returned with a vengeance. The moisture in the men's clothing began to steam. They were being boiled in their own uniforms. The transition from freezing to baking was physically nauseating. Dixon forced himself to stand up, his legs shaking under his weight. He peered over the rim of the berm, his eyes squinting against the glare. The prairie was empty. The Kiowa and Comanche, having endured the same storm without the benefit of the whole, had withdrawn. The siege lines were abandoned. The only sign of the enemy was the trampled grass and the distant carcasses of the horses, now beginning to bloat rapidly in the returning heat. "They're gone," Dixon croaked, his voice sounding like two stones rubbing together. Sergeant Woodhull struggled to his knees, clutching his carbine. The weapon was a rusted, mud-caked club. If the enemy returned now, the patrol would be defenseless. The actions of the rifles were likely frozen or jammed with grit. Woodhull looked at the empty horizon, his military discipline searching for a threat that wasn't there. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum of sound that pressed against their ears, heavier than the roar of the guns had been. The morning dragged on, the time approaching 8 o'clock. The hunger returned, a gnawing, hollow pain in their stomachs, but it was secondary to the exhaustion. They were 5 men who had expended every ounce of physical and mental energy they possessed. They sat in the mud, waiting. They were waiting for help, or waiting to die of exposure, or waiting for the Indians to come back and finish the job. The fatalism of the frontier had settled deep in their bones. Dixon kept his eyes on the horizon to the south. He knew that Colonel Miles was somewhere in that direction, or perhaps Major Price's column. The geography of the plains was vast, and the chances of a patrol stumbling upon a 10-foot hole in the ground were infinitesimally small. Yet he watched. It was the only thing left to do. Around 9 in the morning, a speck appeared on the southern skyline. It was a tiny, wavering dot, distorted by the rising heat shimmer. Dixon rubbed his eyes, smearing more dirt across his face. He looked again. The dot had separated into multiple dots. It was a large body of men. They were moving in a disciplined formation, a dark line that flowed over the contours of the land like a slow-moving snake. "Movement," Dixon said, pointing a shaking finger. "South." The other men dragged themselves to the rim. Hope warred with fear. Was it the Kiowa returning in force, or was it salvation? They watched in silence as the column drew closer. The distance was too great to distinguish uniforms or feathers. They were just dark shapes on light grass. But the formation was tight. Warriors usually rode in a loose gaggle or a broad front. This column was marching in files. "It's cavalry," Harrington whispered, a sob catching in his throat. "It has to be cavalry." "Don't get up," Woodhull warned. "If it's Indians and we show ourselves, we're done." They waited, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The column approached steadily. As the distance closed to a mile, the details emerged. They saw the guidons snapping in the breeze. They saw the blue of the coats dark against the brown prairie. It was a massive force, arguably a full battalion. It was Major William R. Price and the 8th Cavalry moving to intercept the very Indians who had besieged the Wallow. But salvation was not immediate. To the approaching column, the Buffalo Wallow was just a dark spot on the terrain. The soldiers of the 8th Cavalry were on high alert. They had seen the signs of the battle, the dead horses, the scattered equipment. Their scouts were riding carbines ready. They saw movement in the Wallow, dark, mud-covered figures rising from the earth. To the approaching soldiers, the men in the Wallow did not look like United States cavalrymen. They looked like savages. Their uniforms were torn and black with powder. Their faces were masks of mud and dried blood. They were surrounded by the debris of a fight. The lead scouts of Price's column raised their rifles, suspecting a Kiowa ambush or a holdout position of desperate warriors. Dixon realized the danger instantly. They were about to be fired upon by their own rescuers. He grabbed his hat, a battered, shapeless piece of felt, and waved it frantically above the berm. "Don't shoot!" Dixon screamed, though his voice was too weak to carry the distance. "We are white men. We are soldiers." Private Rath stood up, exposing his full body to the guns. He waved his arms, staggering on the uneven ground. "Here! Over here!" The scouts hesitated. They lowered their rifles slightly, squinting through the glare. The frantic waving, the lack of return fire, and the English shouting, faint but audible, caused them to pause. A cautious approach was ordered. A detachment of riders broke from the main column and galloped toward the Wallow, flankers spreading out to encircle the position. As the riders closed to within 50 yards, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The lead officer, a lieutenant with a dust-coated mustache, pulled his horse up sharp. He stared at the pit. He saw the 5 specters standing in the mud and the 6th man lying dead. He saw the piles of spent brass, the bloody water, the tumbleweed roof. The smell of the place hit him, the stench of death and gangrene. "My God," the lieutenant muttered. "Hold fire, they're ours." The cavalrymen dismounted and rushed the Wallow. The relief was physical. Strong hands grabbed the survivors, pulling them from the muck. Canteens were unstoppered and pressed to cracked lips. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the sweetest vintage any of them had ever consumed. Dixon drank until he choked, the water spilling down his chin, washing away streaks of dirt. The soldiers of the 8th Cavalry looked at the survivors with a mixture of awe and pity. They saw the fortifications, The berm dug with knives, the carefully arranged ammunition. They saw the shattered leg of Chapman and the torn uniforms of the others about the situation. It was a scene of utter desperation and absolute tenacity. Major Price rode up, surveying the scene from his saddle. He was a hard man, accustomed to the brutality of the Indian wars, but the sight of the wallow gave him pause. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the pit. He looked at Woodhull, who attempted to snap a salute but nearly fell over in the process. "At ease, Sergeant," Price said, his voice gruff. "Report." "Scout detail, sir," Woodhull rasped. "Carrying dispatches to Camp Supply. Ambushed yesterday morning. We held them off." Price nodded, slowly. He looked at the dead horses in the distance, then at the dead man in the pit. "You held off the whole nation by the looks of it." The extraction began. It was a painful process. Chapman had to be lifted out of the wallow. The movement caused him to scream for the first time, a raw, tearing sound that silenced the murmurs of the troopers. His leg was a ruin. The surgeon attached to Price's column, a weary man with a leather satchel, moved in quickly. He examined the limb, his face grim. There was nothing he could do here but stabilize it for transport. The leg would likely have to come off. Private Smith's body was lifted out next. The rigors of the night had frozen him into a curled position. The soldiers wrapped him in a blanket, treating the corpse with the rough reverence of men who knew they could be next. They laid him on the grass, a silent testament to the cost of the dispatch. Dixon stood on the solid ground of the prairie, feeling the earth beneath his boots. It felt strange not to be in the hole. The horizon, which had been a ring of death, was now open again. He looked at the faces of the rescuers. They were clean, relatively speaking, and well-fed. They belonged to a world that Dixon felt he had left a lifetime ago. The relief, however, was complicated by the reality of logistics. Major Price's column was itself low on supplies. They were on a long patrol, chasing the same elusive enemy. They did not have an ambulance wagon. They did not have extra horses to spare for the survivors. The rescue was not a ticket to immediate comfort. It was merely a reprieve from immediate death. Price spoke to Dixon and Woodhull. "I can't take you with me. I'm moving fast to catch the trail. But I'll send a courier to Colonel Miles. He's behind us with the supply train and the ambulances. You'll have to wait for him." It was a harsh blow. To be found, only to be left behind again. But it was the logic of war. Price could not encumber his fighting column, with 5 wounded men and a corpse. He detailed his surgeon to dress the wounds and left a small amount of hardtack and dried beef. He also left a few men to guard them until Miles arrived, which was expected within the day. "We'll be fine, Major," Dixon said, his voice regaining some of its steel. "We held it alone. We can hold it with a guard." Price nodded. He ordered his men to mount up. The column reformed. The dust rose as the 8th Cavalry continued its pursuit, leaving the survivors once again on the vast stage of the staked plains. But the dynamic had changed. They were no longer alone. They had food, they had water, they had a guard detail with fresh rifles, and they knew the enemy was running. The survivors sat on the grass near the wallow, refusing to go back into the pit. They ate the hardtack slowly, their stomachs cramping at the introduction of solid food. They watched the surgeon work on Chapman. The scout was sedated with morphine, his face slack, the pain temporarily held at bay. Rath and Harrington sat in silence, staring at their hands. They were looking at the dirt under their fingernails, the dirt that had saved their lives. They had dug that fort. They had built it with their own blood and sweat. It was just a hole in the ground, an ugly scar on the landscape. But it was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. As the afternoon of the 13th wore on, the adrenaline finally crashed. The men collapsed into a deep, comatose sleep right there on the grass. They slept through the heat, through the flies, through the noise of the guard detail. They slept the sleep of men who had cheated the reaper. Billy Dixon did not sleep immediately. He sat with his back to a saddle, watching the northern horizon. He thought about the ride, the ambush, the thirst, the storm. He thought about Smith. He touched the stock of his Sharps rifle, the wood warm in the sun. The weapon was empty now, the last cartridge spent or given to the guard. The fight was over. The Buffalo Wallow Fight would become a legend. It would be cited in dispatch reports and medal commendations. All 6 men would eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor for what they did in that 10-foot circle. But in that moment, sitting on the drying grass of the Texas Panhandle, there were no medals. There was only the soreness of the muscles, the taste of the tin canteen water, and the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. Dixon closed his eyes. The wind brushed his face, no longer a gale but a gentle breeze. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with air that didn't smell of gun smoke. He was alive. Against all odds, against the numbers, against the elements, he was alive. And for a man on the frontier, that was the only victory that held any weight.